directors for Illinois Realtors, so I'm regularly on that approval process myself. And like I said, it feels a lot like a rubber stamp. And only in the last really couple of years, when I started actually having to study more and write the curriculum for this stuff, did I start to realize that's an incredibly important due process step. So we're going to cover a broad array of professional standards items, but do understand my focus is understanding you're not the ones that are conducting the hearings, but you have to know enough about what all happens in that process that when you take your look at it, even though I'm telling you from my experience, we will commonly review at Illinois, we'll commonly review 3 or 4 ethics decisions at a time, and we may only spend 5 minutes on them. And if the rest of the process is working the way the rest of the process is supposed to work, it may only require that much time, but it's not because it's a rubber stamp and it's not because it's not incredibly important. So let me get a screen share launched and we will head through the content. So these are just a quick intro. These are my kids. These are also my why. And part of why this is one of my favorite pictures of them is this was just a random morning where they both get up, get dressed for school, and she's in her Dearborn Realtist Black Homeownership Matters shirt, and he is in his Gay Straight Alliance t-shirt, which is just kind of who they are. This is my team. So let me get through to start our content. We're trying to check boxes. As Linda knows, we have a bunch of boxes to check. 3 hours is a long time for you to be here for your particular role as board members, but we need to check boxes for what NAR's requirement is. So when I put all of this together, we're checking boxes for that as well. And so parts of this will bounce around a little bit, but that's largely because we're dealing with a particular box that has to be checked. One of those is a quick overview of business ethics. And hopefully you all know we do this different and we do this better than anybody else. But quick definition, business ethics refers to the standard for morally right and wrong conduct in business. Law partially defines the conduct, but legal and ethical aren't necessarily the same thing. Business ethics enhances the law by outlining acceptable behaviors beyond government control. Corporations establish business ethics to promote integrity among their employees and gain trust from key stakeholders, such as investors and consumers. While corporate ethics programs have become common, the quality varies, and according to a 2018 Global Business Ethics Survey, less than 1 in 4 U.S. workers think their company has a well-implemented ethics program. Now, right now, as our industry exists today, nobody does it like the realtors. How many of you in this group have been on Pro Standards, or are you all strictly board and you've never served on Pro Standards? Okay, no one's ever, okay. So I can tell you from experience when you're in those hearings, part of what's really cool is our system is designed not to require attorneys. And in fact, what we see is when people bring attorneys in, it actually doesn't help. We do this better than anybody else, and we do this on our own. But a lot of other industries don't look at this as being anything that's well implemented. The 3 key reasons are it's a key skill set, business ethics, number 1. Other than presumably whatever the primary skill required for a job being advertised, high integrity and honesty is the second most important skill set for business leaders. Presumably whatever the job that's being hired for is the primary most important. It drives employee behavior. But the self-interested part of this is business ethics helps profitability. Over half of U.S. consumers said they no longer buy from companies they perceive as unethical. On the flip side, 3 in 10 will express support for ethical companies on social media. What do you notice about those numbers? It's over half on the negative side, and it's 3 in 10 on the positive side. Does that not sound like real life? It's the angry people that want to do some rage typing that are the ones that are the first to want to weigh in. But it makes a difference. And you'll find when we talk about the history of the code, it was trying to improve the reputation and improve profitability for practitioners. That was a key consideration. So I want to go through a quick history of the code. So it debuted in 1913. It originally existed because we had no license laws, none. It was a complete vacuum. And so the environment was one where real estate practitioners had a terrible reputation as shysters, as people who were exploitative, and consumers were being harmed in the process. So one of the very interesting things is because even though the code now coexists with myriad other regulations for us, it's not just the code plus the License Act, it's the code plus RESPA, plus regulatory laws, plus fair housing laws. It's all of these things. But when the code debuted, there was no license law. We were operating in a complete regulatory vacuum. We'll talk in a minute about where the code was on the wrong side of history for much of its history. But a quick look at preamble concepts, which again is one of the boxes NAR requires be checked. Realtors should recognize the interest of the nation and its citizens require the highest and best use of land and the widest distribution of land ownership. The widest distribution of land ownership. Such interests impose obligations beyond those of ordinary commerce. They impose grave social responsibility and a patriotic duty to which realtors should dedicate themselves and for which they should be diligent in preparing themselves. Realtors, therefore, are zealous to maintain and improve the standards of their calling and to share with their fellow realtors a common responsibility for its integrity and honor. The phrase I underscored a moment ago was widest distribution, because when we get into some of the history, you'll see that we were doing exactly the opposite when it came to who we were shutting out of the market. When you look at the overview of how this works, you all see this land on your board table and you're having to affirm a decision, but here's kind of where this all starts. We deal in a system of top-down mandates. You all at the local association level are the ones where the rubber meets the road. You are where the enforcement process actually happens. But it's a top-down mandate. It is. I'm a law school graduate. It is akin to federal law, where the same statutes apply everywhere across the country. The National Association of Realtors Professional Standards Committee is who promulgates, interprets, makes periodic changes to the Code of Ethics. That is about a 100-member committee at the National Association of Realtors, and they're charged with adopting article standards of practice, case interpretations, and policies. But the large committee that is in charge of being the keepers of the code doesn't enforce the code. That falls to you. State associations may handle cases that local associations either cannot because of a conflict or a lack of resources, but increasingly you are finding that you've got folks, Linda, you got somebody in the waiting room, just FYI. And if you were saying something to me, you were muted.
Sorry about that. I let him in.
Okay, good. And I didn't know, every once in a while I'll end up being made the host, and then I'll find out later.
I made you a co-host just in case.
Okay, co-host. Yeah, co-host. I wanted to make sure I wasn't exclusively responsible for the waiting room. I don't want anything else to go wrong with my morning.
No, we're all good. You and I are on the same page, Matt. We're good.
So in a lot of parts of the country, we're getting state associations that are actually doing the enforcement, but not all. And the reasons that might happen is it's really difficult to have, I'm from a local association of 500 members strong. I don't want that to intimidate any of you, but it's very difficult at a very small association to have the staff resources, to have somebody who's genuinely a subject matter expert to be a professional standards administrator. And so in many cases, you'll find that locals, by agreement with the state, will send it to the state, but enforcement goes first to the local. State would get it only if the local has agreed to do something otherwise, or if there's a conflict. So here's kind of the structural overview. You got the local association that is the primary enforcement body. The local, though, does not get to interpret the code. You don't get to say the Kent Washington take on this particular article is. No, that's not how that works. Like I said, it's much more akin to a federal statute where it is supposed to be the same anywhere in the country. There is no local code. And we'll talk a little bit later about one of the resources that helps ensure that the interpretation part is uniform regardless of where you are in the country. So the two different types of complaints that we deal with are ethics complaints and requests for arbitration. Ethics complaints are the ones that you're dealing with most. I suppose you may see an occasional request for procedural review post arbitration, but the ones that always have to cross your desk are approval of ethics complaints. And then it is this body that would hear appeals. Is that correct, Linda?
Yes.
Yeah. So you get oddly
in the past, Matt, it's been the executive committee.
Okay. So it's kind of strange because you're not normally in that pro standards pool. And yet when suddenly something gets into the very, very, very deep end of that pool, it goes to you as that board of directors or as the executive committee, a subcommittee of the board of directors. Requests for arbitration, those are typically money disputes, and technically know that those are realtor principal to realtor principal. You'll find that obviously you normally think about the arbitration dispute being between, most commonly, not always, but most commonly, the two realtors who are jockeying for procuring cause and the ones whose own commission is on the line. But understand that arbitration is only realtor principal to realtor principal. The person who has a commission interest in it is permitted to be part of the hearing, but the actual parties to the dispute are going to be the realtor principals. So we got two stages in this process. We start with the grievance committee. So the grievance committee, sometimes people used to make an analogy that was like a grand jury. And grand juries, by the way, are in the news a lot this week, as it turns out. But it's not that way, because a grand jury actually has a probable cause requirement. A grand jury has to determine there was at least probable cause to be able to issue an indictment. And that is not what grievance does. Grievance is simply a screening committee. Grievance does not have any showing of probable cause. Grievance is simply charged with this: look at the complaints and determine that if you take every word of it as gospel truth, you're not there to fact check it or anything else. If what is alleged is assumed to be true, could there be a violation? And if the answer is yes, then it goes through for a hearing. That's the simple part of it. What will often happen is you'll get people who are rage typing complaints. And so the more complex part of the grievance committee's job is you get somebody who rage types complaints. Realtors, I don't expect all of us to know the code chapter and verse, but we know there is one. Consumers are completely unfamiliar with it. And so what will end up happening is staffers like Linda will end up having to open up some complaint that looks like somebody rage typed, 3 pages, single spaced, lots of misspellings, and then put the code of ethics in a blender and then just randomly scooped up a handful of it and threw it all against the wall, because it's just like that. And then that pile of stuff lands on grievance, and grievance has to sort it out. So, question number one is what the narrative is, what the person actually wrote about in their complaint. Is that conduct a potential violation? If yes, it has to go to a hearing, but then grievance also has to sort out, all right, before this went into the blender, which actual articles and SOPs are applicable to this? And remember, when you're getting relatively ignorant, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but when you're getting consumers whose job it is not to know all of this stuff, and you add some anger to it, it just can make a mess. So grievance does have to sort that stuff out. The hearing panel also has the ability to add or subtract articles, but grievance is supposed to sort that stuff out. Stage 2 is going to be the professional standards committee holding the hearing. That is going to be analogous to a trial, where you're going to have the panel and they're acting as basically the equivalent of the jury, and you're going to have the hearing chair acting as the judge. I guess the one key difference is all panelists have the power to ask questions anytime. So all of them are empowered to do that. And then this bottom box, bottom left, this is you. It's the board of directors or a panel of the board of directors, and it's confirmation of every ethics hearing decision or handling appeals. And even if there is no appeal, you may dismiss the findings if those findings do not support a violation. I'm going to give you a little bit of history on the code, and this is checking one of the other boxes on both code history, but also getting into fair housing. I said earlier I was going to talk a little bit about how the code was on the wrong side of history, and so I'm going to go back literally 104 years and show you kind of what the country looked like in a lot of cities, because this happens to be the same decade that the code was first promulgated. So I'm from Illinois. I'm from Champaign, so downstate, 130 miles south of Illinois. I'm not from Chicago. That's why almost every time I'm on camera, you'll see that I'm in Illini apparel, because my hometown is home to the University of Illinois, of which I'm a double graduate. So Chicago Red Summer, this was a picture that ran on the front page of the Tribune, and this was a picture depicting the invisible color line that separated the water in Lake Michigan. And the invisible color line separated the water that was reserved for white swimmers from the water that was reserved for black swimmers, because of course, physics, that all works that way. And 17-year-old Eugene Williams swam across the invisible color line in the summer of 1919 and then was pelted with rocks until he drowned. And when nothing was done about the murder that had just occurred, race riots ensued. And Chicago was not unique. Many cities in the country were absolute tinderboxes where you had Black populations that were confined to very, very small parts of the city, very limited options for where they could live. And it was just a tinderbox environment sort of waiting to explode. And indeed it did in Chicago, as it did in many other cities. So this is a group of white children cheering outside a Black residence that they had just set on fire. White mob chasing a Black resident through the neighborhood with stones and bricks, and police standing over a Black resident who's bleeding from the head. After all of this, in the course of Red Summer, there were dozens of deaths and hundreds of injuries. And it was about a 2-to-1, the casualties 2-to-1 were Black versus white. In fact, the origin of street gangs in the United States was actually Black males attempting to defend and protect the neighborhood here against bands of roving white terrorists. So I switch back over to what the code was doing in this era. This is the Code of Ethics, and this is Article 34 from a version of the code that was first promulgated in the 1920s. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. We had an ethical mandate to engage in housing discrimination. Now, how many, I want to see a show of hands, how many of you are seeing this for the first time? Okay, yeah, about half of you. Yeah, and the final, and by the way, you are all welcome to unmute and interrupt and ask questions and talk at any time. This is one of the smallest groups that I would ever do this for, and so please take advantage of the interactivity because we don't have a big crowd. But yeah, we had an ethical mandate to engage in housing discrimination. And all right, so pop quiz. Now I'm going to force a little bit of interaction. So when did fair housing become the law of the land?
The 1960s.
1968.
Okay, yes. Somebody said 1968. Bonus points. When in 1968?
Go ahead, Bill.
Maybe Joe. June.
I don't
The
have
history
the
nerds,
exact date.
kicking this back and forth. Is that what's happening? So it was April, and the Fair Housing Act was signed into law literally 7 days, exactly a week after the untimely death of Dr. Martin Luther King. It had been a public policy debate that had been bottled up in Congress and had no prayer of passing at that time and during that Congress. And suddenly Congress found the political will when MLK was assassinated. But we didn't, as a trade organization, we didn't add fair housing to our code until 1974. The last vestiges of the discriminatory language, and it was made less overtly racist over the years, but the last vestiges of this type of language didn't leave the code until 1974. And when you look at why was our history this way? Why did we do this? I mean, obviously it's morally repugnant, but what was the fear? If you didn't abide by this, what was the fear? What's the result? If you don't do these things, what's the result? What's going to be the result on the real estate market?
Well, you would lose your realtor
property
membership.
values down.
Property values. Yeah. There were a couple of answers, but yeah, the concern was property. I was about to, so when I look over here, I'm looking at my gallery view and I was, so yeah, and there was actually a report after Red Summer in Chicago. Governments did then what governments do now. They get a blue ribbon panel commission together to figure out what the heck just happened here. And again, I'm going back to this other resource because this is our industry at this particular moment in time, and it shows you what it was that was going on. So this is this report, hundreds and hundreds of pages, The Negro in Chicago. And I'm going to read you a portion from a chapter called Negroes and Property Depreciation. No single factor has complicated the relations of Negroes and whites in Chicago more than the widespread feeling of white people that the presence of Negroes in a neighborhood is a cause of serious depreciation of property values. To the extent that people feel their financial interests are affected, antagonisms are accentuated. When a Negro family moves into a block in which all families are white, the neighbors object. This objection may express itself in studied aloofness, taunts, warnings, slurs, threats, or even the bombing of their homes. White neighbors who can do so are likely to move away at the first opportunity. Assessors and appraisers in determining the value of the property take account of this general dislike of the presence or proximity of Negroes. It matters little what type of citizens the Negro family may represent, what their wealth or standing in the community is, or that their motive in moving into a predominant white neighborhood is to secure better living conditions. Their appearance is a signal of depreciation. So it happens that when a Negro family moves into a block, most of the white neighbors show resentment toward both the Negro family and the owner or agent who rents or sells the property. Note the agent is mentioned there. Whites owning homes in the neighborhood become much exercised by fear of loss of both money and neighborhood exclusiveness and desirability. The Negro suffers under the realization that for reasons which he cannot control, he is considered undesirable and a menace to property values. Wherever Negroes have moved in Chicago, this odium has attached to their presence. The belief that they destroy property values wherever they go is now commonly taken as a valid explanation of any unfriendliness toward the entire group. Crazy, huh? Except you're going to see in a minute that in a lot of ways, that attitude has not changed a whole lot in 100 years. So I'm going to show you what redlining looked like in Chicago.
Can I just make a comment?
Sure.
I'm having a visceral response to that reading.
Okay.
I just am. I'm enamored and I don't know what I am. I don't know that I have anything beyond that. I just can't believe that that was in writing and that was unbelievable.
Well, thanks for stopping us to say that because most of us and most audiences of realtors today would look at that and think visceral is a great word. I mean, it just sickens you. But that attitude was so pervasive, and it was the basis for redlining. And we'll talk briefly about that next. But what I hope you start to realize is the intersection of professional standards and fair housing and the history of housing discrimination and scars still left all over our landscape today. Our fingerprints are all over that. So I'm glad that you stopped to say that.
Yeah,
because the other thing is we all really do have an opportunity to be part of that solution. So I'm going to use Chicago as an example for two reasons. Number one, I don't want to go in and impugn anyone else's home market, and Chicago is such a spectacularly tragic example in many of these cases. So here's what redlining actually looked like. I'm going to use this tract that is part of what is now called Bronzeville. This tract includes a little bit of lake frontage. And if you were standing at McCormick Place looking south, that's the largest convention center in North America where NAR holds conferences every few years. If you were standing at McCormick Place looking south, you'd be looking from the top down into this tract. And the photos you're going to see that accompany the margin notes are public domain photos commissioned by government photographers to document the, the Black community in Chicago at this time. The new housing project has the realtors guessing as to what the ultimate result will be when so many of this race are drawn into this section from the already Negro blighted district. With approximately 6,500 colored people moving into the district, it's evident they cannot be closed in. They must have an outlet, and the problem of keeping park and water frontage close by, reasonably free of them, will be difficult to surmount. The trend of the colored people will now be accelerated toward this park and water frontage, which many people consider could have been avoided had it been located west of Indiana. It's believed, particularly since the advent of the housing project, that this entire section will ultimately go colored, which will increase the number of colored people using the lakefront. Washington Park, shown here in the sketch enjoyed by white women and girls in lacy dresses, is already doomed. So who do you suppose wrote the notes and graded the neighborhoods?
White people. White people.
Well, yes, that's a safe bet. White people. That's
Realtors.
Definitely a correct answer. It was realtors. It was realtors and appraisers. People would assume that it was some, white pencil pushing government bureaucrats from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but it was realtors and appraisers. We drew the lines, we shaded the maps, we wrote the notes, and we wrote notes that in many cases, this being a prime example, described Black and brown Americans in terms that would be analogous to how you would describe an infestation of sewer rats. And in so doing, of course, this was used for the Homeowners Loan Corporation for financing purposes. So when you redlined a neighborhood, you shut off the money supply. So you basically shut the money supply off and trapped people in those neighborhoods with no other options. My mama is a Southern Baptist preacher's daughter from Mississippi, so I have kinfolk in the Deep South and have had the chance to study quite a bit of the history of the civil rights movement in the South. I didn't know till a couple of years ago Martin Luther King moved his family to Chicago. They moved there in summer of 1966, and the sole reason they moved there was to shine a very bright and uncomfortable spotlight on housing conditions in Chicago. Specifically, that Black Chicagoans were subject to deplorable housing conditions. And it's worth noting that by the 1960s, the Black population, just the Black population in the city of Chicago, had reached 1 million people. It was a huge population. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say I've never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago. This is Dr. King leading a march. The destination of the march was a real estate office. And here he is trying to get back on his feet after being hit in the head by a fist-sized rock. This is not the Jim Crow South. This is Chicago, Illinois. Keep neighborhoods white. This was almost everywhere. So now we're in the civil rights era. We're in the 1960s, and fair housing was starting to become a hotly debated public policy matter at the local, the state, and the national level. And so what was the trade organization doing? It was equipping its leaders with everything they needed to oppose fair housing at every step of the way. Literally, they're right. Yes, that was the euphemism, i.e., you can't force me to sell my house to fill in the blank. That was, and when you think about it, it would align so easily with our modern day charge of, well, we protect private property rights, and in this case, the narrative would be protecting private property rights is you can't force me to sell to fill in the blank. And so literally we were distributing propaganda kits to try to make sure that our volunteer leaders had everything they needed to oppose fair housing. And it's interesting, the kit includes suggested publicity program, press releases, brochures, civil rights program for moderates. When it says civil rights program for moderates, I sort of imagine that being how you can oppose fair housing without essentially jumping up and down and saying I'm a flaming bigot. I don't have access to all the contents of the kit, but this picture, by the way, comes right out of NAR's archives. So, for many of you, we've got a fairly good amount of age diversity in this group, but I was born years after the Fair Housing Act was the law of the land. So I knew that white people had fixed it. There they are fixing it right there. And I knew I had to know enough vocabulary to get my license and keep my license. And obviously we got Article 10 in the code. But it didn't occur to me that we still had an issue or that really didn't fix it. This is my friend Frank Williams in Chicago. Frank is one of the few Black past presidents of the Chicago Association of Realtors, also a past president of the Dearborn Realtist Board, the Black trade group in Chicago, also a former NAACP leader. This was Missy, my professional other half, and me when we were in Chicago to interview him for getting a video oral history a few months back. Frank got into real estate in the early 70s. He was working for the U.S. Postal Service. And he was not a stranger to controversy. He got himself kicked out of high school in Flint, Michigan for dating a white girl. He's now been married to her for over 60 years. So he's living in Chicago working for the Postal Service, realizing, there's people that are not as smart as me that look like they're making a good living in real estate. I want to give this a try. And he does. And Frank, though, had several strikes against him. Frank was selling real estate while Black. Frank was selling real estate to Black people. He was selling real estate to Black people in a predominantly white neighborhood of Beverly on the south side of Chicago, and he was doing it while married to a white woman. So Frank's house got firebombed for that. He had a Molotov cocktail detonated on his front porch while most of his family was inside the house because of that. And that was in 1975, years after fair housing was supposedly the law of the land. But interestingly, while the act of terrorism was obviously, a big deal, it was a much more concerted, prolonged, coordinated effort. So for those of you for the younger few of you on this call, back in the olden days, realtors would run their businesses using landlines. It was a telephone that had a cord on it that was on your desk or on your wall. And if you were a realtor, that was your lifeline. You depended on that landline. And a whole group of neighborhood women banded together to call his business line all day long to make sure that he couldn't do business. It was a full court press. So that was the 1970s. Then you look, way into the 21st century, and these headlines come up all the time, still. So I've just got one from the Washington Post and one from the New York Times, but it's basically examples of appraisers coming in with values that seemed really low, and then when the house gets de-blacked and reappraised, the value comes in much higher. So this case, because I'm Black, we realized that he picked houses from the Black side of Park Hill, says Lorenzo, an IT engineer and technology developer. That was the first red flag. Dismayed, the couple scheduled a second appraisal, but this time they decided to experiment. Gwen, who's white, remained alone at the home to greet the appraiser. The second appraiser gave the home a value of $550,000, a $145,000 increase from the first appraisal. The second example from the New York Times. But before the new appraiser could arrive, Ms. Horton, a lawyer, began an experiment. She took all the family photos off the mantle. Instead, she hung up a series of oil paintings of Mr. Horton, who's white, and his grandparents that had been in storage. Now, I usually have to stop at this point to point out to non-white folks, not all of us white folks have oil paintings of ourselves and our family members. Books by Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison were taken off the shelves, and holiday photo cards that were sent by friends were edited, so only those showing white families were left on display. On the day of the appraisal, Ms. Horton took the couple's 6-year-old on a shopping trip to Target and left Mr. Horton alone to answer the door. The new appraiser gave the home a value of $465,000, a more than 40% increase. These happen all the time, and the appraisers aren't doing it on purpose. It happens all the time. This is what implicit bias looks like, and this is all the continued legacy of the segregated landscape that we've helped create as an industry. So when I had the chance to start learning about this, and the only reason that I started learning about this was because I happened to serve as Illinois Realtors president in 2018. And that was the 50-year anniversary of fair housing. So in 2017, when I was president-elect, Illinois, like a lot of other associations, was starting work on 50-year retrospectives and commemorative projects. That was the first glimpse into the history of housing discrimination that I got. And as I learned about it, of course, it's a million layers of terrible, but it's still really hard to actually quantify. But a study in Chicago did that just a couple of years ago, the plunder of Black wealth in Chicago. And this ended up peer-reviewed and published in a lot of major journalism outlets. And you have to forgive me, I'm at the very tail end of a cold from like 2 weeks ago, but I'm still occasionally, I'll still have to duck away from the microphone to cough or clear my throat. So remember I said earlier, when you redline the neighborhoods, you're cutting off the money supply. And those redlining maps were promulgated in the FDR New Deal era. From 1940 to 1960, homeownership was skyrocketing. White Americans had easy access to low-cost, low-interest government-backed loans. Even if you had, in this era, in the World War II and post-World War II era, when the white suburbs were built out, even if a developer was not a racist, what did you have to do in all of those subdivisions to be able to make them viable? You had to have racially restrictive covenants, because even though racist zoning had been deemed unconstitutional much earlier in the 20th century, the government-backed financing wouldn't ensure your development without racially restrictive covenants. So the government was still saying in the post-World War II era, if you don't have racially restrictive covenants, you won't be eligible for FHA or VA insurability. So we trapped Black and brown people in redline neighborhoods, cut off the money supply, and made very easy financing available exclusively to white people and predominantly in the suburbs in this era. That forced Black Americans into a secondary unregulated market of contract sales. That type of sale accounted for between 75% and 95% of homes that were sold to Black families during this era. So as a law school graduate, besides the exploitative pricing, which is terrible, like there's no due process here. If any of you have ever dealt with a short sale or foreclosure, you know, they are our worst nightmare as realtors because they take so long because we are getting due processed to death. There's no due process with this type of sale. If you miss your payment, you lose your house and you have no equity. It's just gone. Over just the 2 decades studied, so one city, one segment of the population, the Black population, in one generation, the 50s and 60s. The cost was pegged at between $3.2 and $4 billion. And that would be the equivalent of stealing on the low end. If we assume $3.2 billion, it would be the equivalent of stealing a $32,000 scholarship fund from 100,000 separate Black college-bound students in one city in one generation. And so after I'd had the chance to learn some of this stuff, I graduated from a diverse public high school here in Champaign, Illinois. And I look back and it's like, oh yeah, housing discrimination was illegal since before I was born, but the impact on generational wealth sure does make me look differently at students that didn't look like me, that wouldn't have had access to the same resources and generational wealth building tools that I did. We're going to talk due process because that's really where your jobs are most important. So this is from an essay called The Code and Its Use. No code of ethics can long survive its misuse or misapplication. This is why the Realtor's Code of Ethics must be applied with continuing and conscientious concern for procedural due process. Procedural due process is both an explicit and an implied requirement of the code. Your entire role in this, all of your role, centers around due process. So that's sort of the most important concept for this particular audience to be aware of today. The due process requirement, after all, requires nothing more than a fair and diligent search for the truth, with an opportunity for all facts to be gathered, all views to be heard, all defenses to be raised, and all prejudice or bias to be expunged. But while due process requires nothing more than a fair and diligent search for the truth, so that the code may be properly applied, due process permits nothing less. There is no acceptable level of unfairness, no permissible slight of the search. Here's why this is so important. So, no pressure, but don't screw it up. Membership in a board of realtors has been recognized by the courts as a valuable property right. Therefore, any action by a board limiting or denying the rights and privileges of a member must be justified, not just substantively, but also procedurally. It's for this reason that a failure to accord due process to a realtor accused of a violation of the Code of Ethics can result in the reversal of the board's decision by the civil courts and can expose the board and its officers and members to liability for monetary damages and other penalties. The stakes are very high. Don't screw it up. So let's talk about this for a minute. This is where we're going to prepare for interactivity. What is this? What's the issue of valuable property right? What's significant about that? All right. Well, let me ask a different question. Yes.
I was going to say the value is based on the way that it's. I'm having a hard time getting it out. I guess the way that it's perceived, who it's perceived by.
Okay. And what's the worst thing you all can do to somebody? What is the worst thing that a duly constituted body of the pro standards or board of directors can do to a member? What's the highest penalty that we have the ability to inflict?
Strip them of their license.
Take away their realtor membership.
There we go. Bill got it. It's the realtor membership, not the license, but goodness knows the association staff constantly get calls from people that think that they control their license, but they don't. Linda's nodding. But anyway, so yeah, we're not the government. We are not the ones that giveth or taketh away people's real estate licenses. So the worst thing we can do to somebody is take away their realtor membership, because the reason that's such a big deal is in most parts of the country, it's kicking them out of the MLS. And so for all practical purposes, if you were to do that, you've now got somebody who no longer can make a living in real estate, particularly if they're a residential practitioner. So the linkage here is, because it's a valuable property right, and because courts recognize it as such, because the power that you all have in this process is so great, that's what triggers this due process requirement. The pro standards system that you are all an integral part of only functions as long as the courts recognize, you know what, we're not going to mess with what the realtors are doing. Their system works. They have rules. They follow their rules. Therefore, if somebody claims, you know what, I want to sue them because they took away my ability to make a living, courts are generally not going to touch that as long as we have rules and we follow them and they involve fairness and due process. All of that is where your jobs get so important. So our system is so sophisticated that we'll occasionally get people who bring attorneys in, and our system is not designed to require attorneys. So what's kind of funny, and I say this as a law school graduate, it's like I watched somebody pay hundreds of dollars an hour to bring an attorney in. The attorney makes it worse, not better, for the party oftentimes. But what often happens is they'll look at what we're doing and they'll see how formal it is, and they'll see how well the system works, and they will absolutely be in awe of how well run the system is. But it's really important, in addition to just being fair to people, treating people fairly, Like I said, if we don't do this right, we find that people that are upset with the outcome will go sue us. And when I say us, I mean that comes to your association and could actually come chase you as individuals involved in the process. So those are the high stakes. That's why it is perfectly okay when Linda's doing her job well, and you've got these findings of fact where you've got all of the dots right there to connect. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't spend more than 5 or 6 minutes reviewing a given case, but it's really important that you review the cases because it's this due process requirement. You're sort of the last step in that process. It's unlikely that you're going to have a pro standards hearing that has run completely off the rails. It's unlikely you're going to have an entire panel of volunteers that are serving on the hearing panel that collectively run off the rails. But if God forbid that were to happen, you all are the last line of defense. That's what you're there looking for. Did some, or another way to put that, did some part of this fact pattern in this particular hearing, or did some part of these parties to the hearing manage to push hot buttons on all of these panelists in a way that caused them to behave in a way that either gave somebody a pass that shouldn't have, or went too far in the other direction and came down hard on somebody who I don't believe the actual findings of fact supported a violation or supported sanctions that were that harsh. These are all the things that you are looking at. The most succinct definition of due process in the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual is this: due process is not a difficult concept, but it is an essential one. It means nothing more or less than the right to a full and fair hearing before an impartial tribunal with a full and complete knowledge of the charges made and with an adequate opportunity to prepare a defense. I'm going to read part of that again because the guts of that are really very succinct. Full and fair hearing, impartial tribunal, full and complete knowledge of the charges, adequate opportunity for a defense. That's it. That is it. Here are the objectives, a whole list of them. This is probably one of my most dense slides. When we do this right, we're providing a procedure that the courts won't mess with. We clearly define to our members what is over the line. Here's the code, but we want to make it clear. Here's what's over the line, and people can understand what's over the line. Sufficiently outline the procedures so that officers of the board from year to year can readily learn how to proceed and follow these rules. Some of you have never sat through this type of training before, and the idea is I really need you to know enough that when that next ethics case comes in front of you to be affirmed, you know, here's my role, here's the rules, and here's what I'm looking for. Eliminate haphazard methods which may result in confusion and dissatisfaction. Clothe the disciplinary body with dignity, which will demand respect by those brought before it. Give the disciplinary body stability so that it may not be subject to personal pressure. Create a method of settling business disputes which will command public respect and confidence of the members. Better protect the board. So we're back to your own self-interest as a group against legal actions, whether we're talking about frivolous lawsuits or something more substantive. Require members to arbitrate those contractual and specific non-contractual disputes that are defined by the manual within the framework of the board rather than going to court over it. And finally, gives members a reasonable assurance that the Code of Ethics will be enforced, the procedure will protect them against unfair and unsubstantiated charges, only respected and qualified persons will sit in pure judgment, and protection is given against the necessity of expensive and unjustified legal actions. That's it. So due process is the single most important concept around which your role wraps. Standard of proof. So this is important because when you're looking at these cases that you're reviewing, you're looking at the findings of fact and you're having to ask yourself, yeah, did we meet that burden? Did that complainant meet the burden? And if a violation was found, was the hearing panel justified in finding that? So in arbitration, it's a preponderance of the evidence. That's defined as evidence which is of greater weight or more convincing than the evidence which is offered in opposition to it. That is, evidence which as a whole shows the facts sought to be proved are more probable than not. I will just say this is a mess. In arbitration, it is a mess, and I'll tell you why. The typical arbitration case, and there are other types, but the typical arbitration case is two realtors going after the cooperating compensation, asserting that each of them was the procuring cause for the sale and therefore entitled to the commission. And what often happens is They both go into the hearing 100% certain of the rightness of their position and their claim, certain that they cannot lose. And then they find out at the hearing, oftentimes, what do you mean my buyer client that I did 30 showings with was doing 30 other showings behind my back with some other agent? And some other agent, in fact, does have virtually as strong a case. And to make matters worse, nobody did anything wrong. Now, sometimes somebody did something wrong, but in many cases for arbitration, you got two parties and nobody did anything wrong. If anyone did do anything wrong, guess which party it was? It was the client. It wasn't the realtors. Yeah, it was the client. The client. What do you mean you were running around behind my back, having an affair with a different agent? So that's a messy area. So you have no one did anything wrong. You have a really murky gray area that these arbitration cases live in. Oh, yes. And on top of all of that, the burden of proof is, I don't know, it's a virtual tie. Whose case is slightly stronger than the other? I mean, that's what it comes down at. Also, in arbitration, generally speaking, you are not to split the award. You can't say, oh, they both have similarly strong cases, so we're going to split the award. No, you're not generally supposed to do that. It's an all or nothing proposition. So one of the things that, because of that, think about how big a deal that is. And Linda knows how often people will get to the hearing and only at the hearing realize, maybe 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the hearing, holy cow, I had no idea my case is not as strong as I thought it was, right? She's nodding because that happens all the time. We now have in the script for arbitration hearings, as a final step before we go into executive session, basically, would you two like to get a room? Can we get you a room together? We say that to the parties. Would you like us to put you in a private space over here to talk about this? Because when this happens, I just told you, we have to do an all or nothing. And they may realize, I thought I was entitled and that the other person had no case at all. Now I realize I'm not nearly so sure that I'm going to prevail. And if I don't prevail, it means I get nothing. But there's no prohibition against the parties negotiating it amongst themselves and agreeing to a commission split, agreeing to some sort of a referral fee or whatever they want. So we now have that as part of the process. And also we have a funnel of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that include ombudsman. On the ethics side, it would be ethics citation. On the arbitration side, it includes mediation, because we don't want people getting to the hearing and only at the hearing, when people already hate each other, find out, oh, well, if I'd known that, I wouldn't have done this, or I would have negotiated for a compromise earlier. So that's the part that's tricky with arbitration. Again, most of what you're seeing is going to be affirming of ethics decisions. So ethics decisions,
So
the
Matt,
good news is,
Matt,
Sure.
I'll let you know, I've been with this association for 8 years, and we require mediation prior to arbitration.
God bless you for that.
And we haven't had an arbitration case. They've all been settled through mediation.
So that is the ultimate test, because it's not because the procuring cause disputes don't come up. It's because once they go to mediation, in your case, 100% success rate. Success rates that are 60, 70, 80% are very, very typical when you're talking about ombudsman and or mediation. 100% is really, really, really good. And since you all aren't the ones that sit in the hearing, you get to look at this relatively quickly after it's all said and done. But man, to sit in a hearing and realize this never should have gotten here, there's a few of them that should, clearly, but a lot of them never should have gotten here. And so that's proof that your mediation system is working well. Do you do ethics mediation? Just curious.
We have, but it's not typical.
Yeah. Okay.
Most of the complainants are not willing.
Right. So ethics mediation, because no one asked, but I was kind of looking over to see your faces. Nobody asked, but it's like, no, wait a minute. How do you mediate an ethics complaint? And, in many cases, you get somebody who is a would-be complainant who doesn't. A lot of times you'll get people who will say, and again, Linda being the frontline person in your association, you get pro standards administrators who take the calls from the public. And a lot of times the first thing they'll say is, I don't want to get the person in trouble. But I'm calling because somebody did something really bad, but I don't want to get him in trouble. Or in the case of realtor to realtor complaints, it is, I got to work with this person again. I'm going to see them again in the marketplace. And so there's a lot of reasons they may not want to go, full nuclear and do a full-on ethics complaint. So in the case of ethics mediation, you're doing a negotiation to settle something that could be an ethics complaint and could be deemed a code violation. But a lot of times you have people that really are satisfied with a genuine apology and and getting to understand that you did something wrong and not doing it again. But as Linda said, in many cases, you get people say, no, I am filing this complaint. By the time they get to the point of filing the formal complaint, nope, I'm ready to have my name attached to it and to go forward. So with ethics, it's a clear, strong, and convincing standard. If I were going to assign a numerical percentage to these standards of proof, with preponderance, you're talking 51%. Anything over 50, and that's who gets it. When you're talking clear, strong, and convincing, that's probably somewhere in the 75% range. It's not the level of proof for a criminal conviction, because in the case of a criminal court, you're literally depriving somebody of their liberty. You're incarcerating them. And so that's beyond a reasonable doubt. Clear, strong, and convincing shall be defined as that measure or degree of proof which will produce a firm belief or conviction as to the allegations sought to be established. So when you're looking at this, at the tables that you sit at, you're looking to make sure, based on this finding of fact, based on what we're seeing here, was this panel reasonable in deciding that the complainant met the burden, and with a clear, strong, and convincing showing demonstrated that there was, in fact, a violation. I said really early in our first few minutes together that we had resources to help ensure that we did not end up with a local interpretation of the code. And one of those resources are case interpretations. So again, coming from a law school background, I spent 2 summers as a law clerk, which basically means I'm a research mole. I'm a research mole, and I am constantly digging around in appellate and Supreme Court opinions, because those are binding precedent. And so that's how you're determining, well, what do we ask a judge for at the local court based on appellate court binding precedent holdings in similar cases? Well, the problem, of course, in pro standards is what we do is done in secret. There is no, well, let's go look and see how the last 10 panels handled this, because it is all done in secret. And so the closest thing that we have to that type of thing is these case interpretations, many of which, not all, but many of which do actually come out of real fact patterns that pro standards hearing panels have decided. Some of them are purely hypothetical, because I can tell you, having sat on and chaired the body that comes up with these things, some of them we're coming up with as pure hypotheticals, because we know that it's a type of scenario that will come up in the field, and we know that our volunteers will need guidance on, in this sort of fact pattern, what is this supposed to be deemed a violation, or is it not? So the important thing to know here is these aren't optional, these aren't advisory, these are binding. And so if a given fact pattern, according to a case interpretation, is deemed to be a violation, then it needs to be a violation in Kent, Washington, or Urbana, Illinois, or in Berkeley, California, or in Austin, Texas. In any of those places, or Missoula, Montana, which is where we do have litigation over new standard of practice 10-5. So all of those places, it is uniform, and the case interpretations help. The Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual, just so you all kind of have an idea of the world that Linda lives in, like I have said repeatedly, it's perfectly fine when your jobs only require a few minutes per ethics case. But Linda's world consists of a 350-page Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual. It's sort of the pro standards Bible. So it's hundreds of pages of due process. And it has the forms and all of the procedures and amending complaints and all sorts of mind-numbing stuff. So all of that is in there. In addition, the case interpretations, I think you can acquire those in print, but almost nobody does, because these are changed almost every year, and that's hundreds more pages of case interpretations. We have many, many hundreds of pages of due process and guidance as part of this. All of that is Linda's job, and all of you should be very thankful as I say that you don't have Linda's job. But that's why the pro standards administrators are so important, because what we need from you is your heart and your mind. We need you to have an understanding of due process and fairness so that you are equipped to handle these. But Linda's got the complicated, buried in the weeds job where she's having to deal with all of the technical details. But when she serves up to the board of directors findings of fact in those ethics patterns, again, you've got all the dots right there to connect to determine, did that panel do right under the code? So what do we get to do? What can we do to people? Here's the possible sanctions: letter of warning, letter of reprimand, and we're going generally from least severe to most severe. Required attendance of ethics or other courses. Reasonable fines up to $15,000. Suspension of membership. No, suspension is defined as 30 days to a year. Expulsion. Now, expulsion means that you can potentially come back someday, but it'll be after typically a year or more, and you're coming back in like a brand new member with all the new member requirements and fees. MLS suspension, and then sort of this last other, which is not necessarily the most severe, but a requirement to cease and refrain. Basically, it's a cease and desist power that we have. Any questions about this stuff? Because this stuff is what you're looking at. Oh, great. Stunned silence. So some of the things that we deal with are, you've got, and Linda is almost certainly the one that's looking at this. Okay, we found somebody a panel has found somebody in violation. Linda is there in a supporting role. They're looking at sanctions. They decide we want to recommend or require that the person attend an ethics course. But you can't say they are going to do it in the next 14 days when you know full well that the one that your state offers is only twice a year and the next one's not for 3 months. So you got to take into account certain things like that. Reasonable fines. We're going to talk about an example where you have to figure out what is reasonable, but 15,000 is the maximum of what we are able to charge. So I'm going to use a particular case study example from Article 3. This is the cooperation mandate. It's basically you have to cooperate with realtors except when it's not in your client's interest to do so. And the obligation to cooperate does not include the obligation to share commissions, fees, or to otherwise compensate. So while cooperation and compensation are often interconnected in our world, cooperation is the ethical mandate, and it does not automatically go with compensation. So here's something that's happened in our markets, particularly in the hot market, relatively low inventory. Realtors shall not misrepresent the availability of access to show or inspect a listed property. Well, how does that look with a coming soon? The fact pattern that we hear all over the place is, I'm going to quote a former disgraced and imprisoned convicted felon governor of Illinois, Rod Blagojevich. So when Rod Blagojevich was being investigated and his phone calls were being wiretapped by the FBI, Rod Blagojevich, what got him into trouble, I mean, there were a lot of things, but what really got him into trouble is Barack Obama had been a U.S. senator from the great state of Illinois, and he'd been elected president. That vacated a United States Senate seat, and it fell to the Illinois governor to appoint a replacement for that Senate seat. And so the then governor, Rod Blagojevich, decided, I'm going to sell the Senate seat. I'm going to try to sell it. And so in these wiretapped conversations, one of the things that the governor said, which is a lovely quote that can be used in many different settings, is referring to this Senate seat. The governor said, I've got this thing and it's effing golden. Well, that's how a lot of realtors treat their pocket listings in a scarce inventory environment. I got this thing and it's effing golden and you don't have one. And so, with a little creative marketing and putting it in the private listing network, but saying that it's no showings, but putting a sign up, I may be able to double end this. And so the fact pattern that comes up is, and one that I was involved with at my office in my capacity as broker owner. It didn't happen to me personally, but in my capacity as broker owner. So somebody had a coming soon listing. One of my agents was out showing. Client saw the coming soon sign, wanted to see it. Agent looks it up, sees the basic details, not available for showings, calls the agent, can I show it? No, not showable yet, and be showable at some point in the future. Buyer says, I'm a contractor, whatever it is they're doing to it to get it ready, I'd just as soon see it as is. Agent calls again, explains that situation. No can do. Literally, those are the words in the text message. No can do. So what does the consumer do at this point? Frustrated buyer. What do you suppose the buyer does at this point?
Maybe he contacted the listing agent directly.
Yes, the frustrated buyer who can't get satisfaction from his own buyer's agent contacts the listing agent and says, I would like to see your listing at this street address. And what do you suppose that listing agent said while it was sitting in the private listing network with showings? No. Sure, I'd be happy to show it to you. When would you like to see it? And that agent double ends the deal. So in a case like that, right, the nonverbal is spectacular. So in a case like that, what's happening is, first of all, it smells like an arbitration case, but it's not. There's no procuring cause. We never got across the threshold. Our agent never got a chance to get across the threshold at all. And so in that case, the best we can do is just file an ethics complaint. And in that case, the respondent was found in violation. But let's talk sanctions in this case. You know, we've got reasonable finding, but let's talk sanctions. What do you think would be reasonable? And how, on what basis would you make that determination?
I mean,
Well, I think
could-
a requirement of an ethics course would be in order.
And okay, yeah, and we did. What do you think when it comes to fines? How would you look at the fine?
it depends if it's a first infraction, second infraction, but it's probably going to be a slap on the wrist, truth be told.
Well,
Maybe
was
1,000,
Yeah, so
5,000.
yeah, so let's think about this. Let's say it is a first offense. Let's say it's a first offense, except so normally in Linda's world of first offenses, you're probably going to see monetary fines that are going to be, $500, $1,000 maybe. But here's the problem. In this case, if we were to do a typical first offender fine and there was a $5,000 commission earned on this deal, see, Mary's brain quickly went there. Now what do we have? We have that the fine is still the cost of doing profitable business.
Yep.
Was somebody starting to say something?
Yeah, he did. We just had one of these. I don't know if we're allowed to say that in this venue, but we just had one of these ethics. One of these cases come before us, and it's worth it to the agent who is doing something unethical. It's almost worth it to them to do it because the fine is so low that who cares? They still made money.
Right.
And that's even if they get caught.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of
Yeah,
agents
so-
are afraid to report anybody.
So again, you're not the ones that are at the hearing level, but when you see these come across, that would be a type of a fact pattern where, no, wait a minute, that's not this person had no prior history of violations and we've got a several $1,000 fine here. What am I missing? But again, in that case, that's one of those things you want to be looking at. It's not unreasonably harsh because under those circumstances, that was what was justified, because if it was anything less than several $1,000s, the agent is still profiting at the end of the day from the unethical behavior. So that particular fact pattern is one that just requires re-examining from sort of an economic incentive, disincentive standpoint. All right, what's reasonable, even though that's not what we would normally look at in terms of a dollar amount for a first offender. On the other extreme, how many of you were very new at this? Like you've not done this your first annual cycle where you're dealing with these at all? Oh, just one of you. Okay, a couple of you. Yeah. So on the other end of the spectrum, we've got a whole array of frequent flyer violations that are very, very low level, typically on fines, because they were unintentional. It's not like anyone was victimized by it. And typically those would be, for example, an inadvertent Article 12 blind ad violation. Those are the sorts of things where somebody doesn't have a pattern of doing it and they say it was done unintentionally, or I had a staffer, or I submitted a logo to a nonprofit for a race t-shirt, and instead of Remax Realty Associates, which is the name of my company, instead they just put Remax and it was deemed a, that type of thing. Yes, it's still an Article 12 violation. There's not a special place in hell for you, and you're probably getting what amounts to an entry-level fine. Makes sense? And then, of course, you would see those escalate quickly if somebody develops a pattern of doing that. Providing access to listed property on terms that aren't what is permitted. That's a big deal. I don't know the specific nuances of your state law, but you know, here in Illinois, it's a very fine line between an unauthorized showing and a Class X felony home invasion. It's a big deal. And here we've ended up with, in our ethics citation, unauthorized access was one of the biggest hot buttons 10 years ago when we were doing this in the Chicagoland area. Again, not my market, but in the aftermath of the Great Recession, you would get unethical agents that would give away their the super lock, I guess. Well, no, super is my system of central lock, to give away a central lock access card and invite their clients to take a self-guided REO tour, you know, foreclosure tour. And so unauthorized access here, when we implemented ethics citation, it was $1,000 minimum fine, and it's still a common violation. So now it's a $2,500 minimum fine. And that's for the expedited system. I mean, the fine can go higher if it goes to a hearing. So that's a frequent flyer item, but it's one where you have to look at, well, you know, where does that end up falling in terms of severity and what an appropriate fine would be. Now, let me see where we are on time, so I know if you were owed a break. Yeah, we'll go for a little while longer. Yeah, a little while longer.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what we see a lot of is sold before listing, sold and then put on the MLS. Okay, you know, after it's been under contract. So we see a lot of those.
Yeah, we do too. And you know, clearly we would have, and this is what the hearing is going to be designed to elicit, a couple of factors. There's going to be a pitch for alternative dispute resolution in what I'm about to say. We don't want, and you as volunteers don't want, to find that everyone is having to file full-on, and especially Linda. Linda would suffer the most under what I'm about to say. We don't want everyone to say, I've now got to file a complaint. I'm not sure that they broke the rules, but it smells bad. But now I have to file a complaint just for purposes of discovery, because then Linda gets buried under paper. You're dragging people in, you're subjecting them to all of the hearing due process. But the one-off example, except it seems to happen more often than a one-off, would be, you know what? My home owners, my sellers, showed it to a neighbor. I had no idea. And before I knew it, the neighbor had written an offer. I never made it available for showings. No one ever showed it. It's under contract. There's no violation here. Now, obviously, you know, maybe 1 out of 10 of those cases would have an explanation like that would all stack up. But like, it happens way more often than could possibly be explained by that type of scenario, you know, which leads us to think either somebody was violating MLS rules and holding it out of the MLS while they were effectively trying to go ahead and market it, or they were breaking rules, having it in the MLS unavailable to show, and then it goes straight from private listing network showings no to pending. Well, how did it go pending without ever being showable? This happens everywhere all the time right now. It is a issue that is being exacerbated by the tight inventory conditions. And what's interesting is, sitting where you sit, looking at pro standards ethics decisions, you are going to find that the mix of violations does change, because certain violations become more common because of the reduced inventory, because there's just not enough listings, not enough homes to go around. But yes, that is a very, very common complaint. I get agents from my firm's roster calling me all the time to complain about that. I'm going to give you another article. Let's see. Yeah, we'll break around the bottom of the hour, but I'm going to tell you a story about standard of practice 3-11. So this is relatively new. This was adopted in 2020. So the conversations were had in 2019 about this. Realtors may not refuse to cooperate on the basis of a broker's race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Seems pretty logical, right? Well, this didn't exist until a couple of years ago. And when I sat on so there's the NAR Pro Standards Committee, that's the 100-member committee. There's a subset that's the nerdier group. It's the Professional Standards Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board, aka INTERPS. That's a group of about 18 that has several attorneys, and they're the nerdier group that kind of chews over agenda items and help shape the agenda for the full committee. So in 2019, in the spring, we're meeting for a day and a half to look at items to put on the agenda for the Pro Standards Committee. And somebody, not the example I'm going to give you, but somebody elsewhere in the country wrote a letter saying, we needed to adopt a new standard of practice that basically was this. And before we could consider it, the NAR staff exec said, you know what? Legal has asked that we not touch this. Legal has asked that we not implement what you see on your screen here. We're like, what? Why not? Like, why would we not want this? Well, legal thinks that, first of all, the general words of Article 3, which is, realtors shall cooperate except when it's contrary to their client's interest, already implicitly prohibits discrimination on this basis. And secondly, if we made a new rule that makes it explicit, it'll make it look like we allowed that up until now. And, it wouldn't look good. Except the problem was, I'm sitting around a table of white people, but many of my very best friends are industry leaders in Chicago. And I had just heard about these ladies' story the preceding October. In October of 2018, I was at a fair housing event that the Chicago Association of Realtors had hosted, and I heard the story of Kimberly and Michelle. So Michelle is the CEO of the Chicago Association of Realtors. She's a Chicago South Side native. She was working in a commercial association job in Washington State when she was hired to be the first Black CEO of the 17,000 member Chicago Association of Realtors. So she's moving cross country, and it's something of a homecoming. Tremendous job. The Chicago Association rents the 8th floor of the Realtor building on the Magnificent Mile. She has a lovely corner office overlooking the Mag Mile. I don't know how much she gets paid, but it's well. She gets paid well. So she calls her sorority sister and friend Kimberly Offord, who was a designated managing broker on the south side of Chicago. And at that point, when Michelle and her husband and her baby were moving to Chicago, at that point, they needed to land someplace in a high-end rental within walking distance of the Realtor building. So we are north of the river in Chicago, and north of the river means not very many people that look like these two, at least not that live there. And so when Kimberly was doing her job, making inquiries on behalf of Michelle with high-end rentals, in response to a Black Southside agent making an inquiry on a high-end rental, a landlord's rep said, "Is your client a Section 8 voucher holder?" Like, how could you possibly have somebody who is financially qualified on his or her own merits for something like this? And by the way, what are you doing up here in this part of the city? And so Michelle mentioned that she was just started the job. She mentioned this around the office to a couple of people, and she wasn't making a huge deal of it at all. But one of the government affairs staffers, a white female, heard her mention this and was appalled. Got about 10 times more exercised over it than Michelle herself had been, and said, "Well, you need to file a complaint." "Beth, I'm not filing a complaint." "Michelle, that's terrible. That's wrong. You have to file a complaint." Michelle said, "No, I'm not." And when Beth persisted, Michelle finally said, "You don't understand, Beth. If I filed a complaint every time stuff like this happened to me, my entire life would be spent paralyzed filing complaints, and I would never get anything done." So she did not file a complaint, but she did, Beth filed a complaint, as it turns out. But Michelle did tell her story as part of a fair housing event where a bunch of Chicago leaders told their firsthand, either recent or ongoing accounts of housing discrimination and discrimination that they were facing in the market if they were from any historically marginalized group. So fortunately, when this was discussed, I was able to say, listen, implicit is not good enough, because I just heard these two ladies' story. And so the staff exec said, "Let me run it through legal again. Let me see what I can get done." And she came back and said, "Legal is okay if we proceed, as long as we indicate that we believe this to be a clarification, because Article 3 already prohibited this." And indeed, it passed at that point, and I got a chance to write an article about this. But it was interesting. In this case, it was an issue of black and white. Kimberly was being discriminated against because she was a Black Southsider in a very expensive white part of the city in that moment. But think of the other ways that this impacts our industry. I like that agent. They're a really hard worker, but they don't speak English very well, and they have a thick accent. I can't understand them, and so I'd rather not work with them. Or I knew Lana when Lana was Jeffrey, and I'm kind of uncomfortable being around trans people, and so nothing personal. I think she's really smart and all, but I don't want to work with Lana because Lana's trans. No, you don't get to do that either. All of the protected classes. But the reality is, this is a relatively new addition to the code, because this is still an issue in the marketplace. So with that, we will take a 10-minute break, and come back at, let's make it like a 12 or 13-minute break. We'll come back at 40 minutes after the hour and roll through the rest of our content. Okay, see you in a few. So during break, my conversation with my amazing senior administrative assistant, she's worked for me for 12 years and she is an organizational steel trap. And our conversation was, hey, Tracy, guess what? Our friends in Kent, Washington aren't in Kent, Washington. They're in Rhode Island. Guess what you did with my appointment and the time zone. It was an expletive laden conversation on her part, not on mine. Not on mine.
It let us
And to
ease
make-
into our morning a little, Matt. It's okay.
Right, and to make matters worse, she and I are juggling multiple email threads from multiple associations in Washington State, and now we have Kent, Washington that's not in Kent, Washington. And of course, once I reorient, it's like, oh, well, I also love my Rhode Island friends as well. So how big is your local?
We're around about 2,000.
Oh gosh. Okay. Yeah, Linda agreed. That was good. Whatever. Yeah, I was like, who wants to volunteer the answer, and then see if Linda agrees. That's good size. Yeah, like I said, mine is only is
You're
only
muted,
500.
Linda, somehow. One more
Okay,
time.
so in our it's 9:40. So in our remaining time together, so we're going to do fast coverage with minimal interaction on a few other example cases, just so you get some coverage and where the rubber meets the road on a couple of other articles. Because when I'm putting together a package that hits NAR's requirements, we have to do a somewhat deeper dive into a few different articles, and they sort of give you a subset of articles to do coverage on. So I'm going to hit a couple of examples that get to be a little bit in the weeds. And again, understanding that your role is likely going to be seeing something like that coming out of a hearing panel and determining if it was justified, makes sense, comports with due process requirements. So the quick Article 16 spotlight. This is the don't jack around with other people's exclusive representation. That's a paraphrase. Those aren't the exact words of the article, but that's the sentiment. And the most technical and dense standard of practice under Article 16 is this lengthy SOP 16.2, which is basically, it's okay if you're doing a general distribution. So if you think old school, postcards, direct mail, if you're doing it to an entire postal route, some of those mailboxes will be in yards that also have a yard sign, and that's okay. You didn't target the person because of their yard sign. You were doing a blanket mailing, a general distribution. And so general distributions are allowed. So when you get into standard of practice 16.2, here's basically the safe harbor. It's not precluding realtors from making general announcements to prospects describing their services, even though there may already be an existing relationship. A general telephone canvas, general mailing or distribution addressed to all prospects in a given geographic area or in a given profession, business club or organization or other classification or group is deemed general. Okay, so that sentence is key to the fact pattern I'm going to give you. General canvas, general mailing or distribution addressed to all prospects in a given geographical area or given profession, business club, or organization. So if you've taken some sort of a group and you're hitting everybody, you're fine. Then the flip side is what you're not allowed to do is target people because you see, oh, I know how to find people that need to sell houses. They've got their house listed for sale. I know they need to sell their house. I'm going to target them. So you're not allowed to target people where you're fishing for the data from the MLS, or because you're targeting because you know it's for sale and already listed. So here's the case study. This was a hearing that I ended up as the chair of. This, by the way, should not have gone to a hearing. This should have started with an apology. This was a clash of egos that turned into an ethics hearing. So the basic fact pattern was we had somebody who uses a data service to compile canceled and expired listings at midnight every night. And so he gets served up, hot and fresh every morning. Here's the previous day's canceled and expired. And this respondent will then send, in the case of the day in question, about 100 text messages soliciting business from the text numbers that were deemed canceled or expired. And by the way, he's not getting the text numbers from the MLS. The big data service is cross-referencing the property addresses with public records and generating the cell phone numbers. So in other words, this big data tool is generating the numbers in a compliant manner, because you can't go harvesting private data from the MLS either, of course. So he's doing his 100 text messages. And one of those text messages on that morning hit somebody who was already relisted. She had listed, her listing was changed for a couple of weeks, a few weeks, to temporarily no showings, then crossed the hot sheet as canceled, but then got relisted at some point the next morning, late in the morning. Meanwhile, this gentleman sends these messages out via text, and seller called seller's agent. Seller's agent then calls the complainant, and okay, Linda's having a microphone issue. Calls the complainant, and instead of, hey, I think you might, in case you weren't aware, it was, hey, you solicited my listing client. That's an ethics violation. She just laid into him. And so she could have been a little more gracious. He could have responded by saying, I am so terribly sorry. Didn't know it had relisted. I contacted them only because I saw it had been delisted. No harm intended. Please accept my apology. Do you suppose that's what he said? No, of course not. He said, I'll have you know that is not a violation of the code of ethics. That is specifically allowed under one of the standard of practice. So I am not breaking any rules. And so now the clash of egos is on. And she said, the hell you're not. I'm going to file a complaint. And so now we end up with a hearing. So here's our fact pattern. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to read through this, and we'll talk about it for just a minute. So what do you guys think?
I think you probably should have sent a text message out with a disclaimer.
Okay, so that's a fair point, and that comes up pretty much every time I use this as an example. But so interestingly, if you're in that safe harbor, if you're deemed to have done it, if it's deemed to be a general distribution for the purposes of this SOP, it doesn't matter if you have a disclaimer, it's still not a violation. Now, this disclaimer may be a good idea so the person that receives it, whether it's via text or at their mailbox, knows, hey, if you already have your property listed, this isn't for you. So Lori's point is a good one. It wouldn't be a bad idea to have a disclaimer that makes clear, if you're listed, I'm not trying to poach your listing, but having it or not having it doesn't dictate whether there was a violation, because goodness knows, if we could disclaim our way out of violations, there would be a lot of things we could do differently. My favorite is the, I do not own the rights to this music. So not only does that not disclaim you out of any liability, you have basically just said to the whole world, I know I'm violating copyright laws. Watch, hold my beer and watch me do it. So here's the issues here. We got to figure out with this fact pattern. So incidentally, I'll call out the one thing. So this would have had us as a panel split for sure. The only reason that we all found the person in violation is because he said, and the respondent was a non-native speaker of English. And even if that weren't the case, when you're in hearings, a lot of times, once that respondent is face to face with what looks like kind of the intergalactic tribal council, it's very intimidating. People will start stammering and they just get intimidated and sometimes confused. But it was this 7/16 date, because we're dealing with listings that expired on the overnight of the 18th, and he sends out the text messages on the 19th. And the respondent said, but he was using information about the 16th. Well, everyone agreed that everyone stipulated the fact that it was still listed on the 16th. So as the chair of that hearing, I asked him again, giving him the chance to recognize that he may have misspoken, and he retestified to the 16th. And that was the only reason all of us found him in violation. So this is a good example because we were not at all in consensus but for that. So if I change that one bit and we assume that the respondent was using hot, fresh, expired from the overnight before, here's the sorts of issues we got to look at here. We have to decide, does this qualify as general for the purposes of this SOP? This SOP didn't contemplate text messaging. It's not specifically listed. And so questions become, okay, was this a general list? Well, he was attempting to target only those that were no longer listed. So that would appear to be on solid footing. If he's doing it with his thumbs and he's doing them sequentially, one after the next times 100, he may be doing that for a full hour. And at what point, if it got relisted, so if he pulls his list and it's from midnight and he decides it's a Saturday morning, I'm not going to start sending text messages out till 9:30 a.m. And he starts sending them at 9:30, and this one is the 75th out of 100. And at 9:37, it gets relisted and he texts at 10:30. Well, I mean, is he liable then? Should he have known? Is he obligated to go back and recheck the MLS for every single address before every single text message?
Yes.
Does it matter if he's okay?
Absolutely. We were told, I mean, how I was taught was, if you see expired listings, okay, you have to double down and check to see if it's been relisted or not. So according to this scenario, it was still listed, but with no showings. All right. So,
but then actually did get pulled as canceled during the overnight.
okay, but the agent, before they sent the text out. So I never rely on, if you hire a third party company and whatever they do, you're responsible for what they do. Okay. So I would say he was in violation because he should have double checked on the MLS to see if it was relisted. So,
okay. So Deb raises a whole bunch of good issues, and they are good issues. I want to call out the fact that you all are going to have a self-selection bias. Those of you who already are willing to take your time and energy and talent and volunteer it in leadership, you're already going to be people who are generally on top of things. If we're dealing with an actual pro standards group, if we're dealing with the pro standards committee, the people that do the hearings, those folks are off the charts rules followers. I mean, so there's a self-selection bias. They're not going to be in my pro standards audience if they're not already off the charts rules followers, which is to say they take a very dim view of people who are not so compliant. And so Deb also then brings up another point, but it's also a little bit of a hot button, and I'm not criticizing it, but the hot button is people who are lazy and over rely on big data. They're still ultimately the buck stops here person. The buck still stops with them. You can't blame it on the big data if the error was there. But that means that we still have to look very critically at, does this fall into a good faith belief that this was going out to properties that weren't actively listed? And of course, if a postcard mailing campaign, if somebody had clicked, because now people are doing that ordering process in just a handful of clicks online. So let's say that it got relisted at 10:30 in the morning, and at 10:15 he clicked to send out the postcards, which aren't going to arrive in the mailboxes for 3 or 4 days. And they, disclaimer or not, I think we would agree that that was a general distribution and he wasn't liable. But then are we looking at exactly when the mouse click happened? Are we looking at, does somebody really have to go cross-check every address between every single text message? Or is there a grace period? And if we think there's a grace period, all right, no, he did check that morning. In fact, he was relying on information that, and I'm not taking a side here, I'm just giving you kind of both sides of this. He was relying in good faith on information, believing these were all properties that were no longer on the market. So when he sent it to the whole group. Doesn't matter if it wasn't done with his thumbs, but instead it's a CRM using a virtual text feature where it's like a mail merge where you click and all of the text messages go out at one moment in time. Does that matter? So we've got a bunch of different issues here to determine, does this fit within the definition of that exemption because it was a general distribution. So this was one where the person was found in violation. It would have, but that was only because he had a date that, based on that one date, everyone agreed, all right, well, now you're over the line. But if it hadn't been for that, this would have been one where people could have come down on either side and had a perfectly good reason for doing so. But I would say Deb used a hot button that was a really good example. those of us who are deeply involved may take a very, very dim view of certain practices, even if the practice itself doesn't violate the code. So we still need to be really careful of, did this panel, were they unduly harsh because they all happened to have big data as a hot button, for example, and were therefore a little biased to be more harsh with the respondent than they would have otherwise if he had done the very same thing but had been doing so manually. So just an
So-
example. And go ahead.
I think this could have been prevented by
they all could have been prevented
by communications when the listing agent said, "Hey, I relisted." His response or her response should have been a lot different. So
yes, this would. So yeah, the other reason I use this example is that both parties were just jerks to each other. She laid into him instead of calling with a tiny bit of humility. Hey, I'm assuming you probably didn't mean to do this, but, and let's just say, a lot of what we have to do is driven by our clients. You may have had a seller that was either upset or just confused. Hey, I thought you said my condo was getting relisted this morning, but I just had somebody call me saying it was off the market. So, you get that starts it. You now got a listing agent who's feeling a little flustered, not unlike I did when I realized that I was 3 time zones off this morning. So they're flustered. Now nothing else goes right because all of a sudden, yes, right, I know how it feels. So then all of a sudden, your hair's on fire. You're sliding into all of this and it's just craziness. So now she may have perfectly valid reasons why she's pre-agitated. And this guy, instead of being slightly humble, is just digs his heels in. But no, it absolutely shouldn't have gone to a hearing. And nobody has a special place in hell for this particular violation. It's not like this was creating, there was not a crime spree in process that this was solving. This was just a battle of wills. It was bragging rights. All right, so we're gonna spend pretty much the rest of our time together looking at Article 10 stuff, and we're gonna do that for a few reasons. Article 10 is fair housing. Article 10 is a big deal. Article 10, as you can tell, is a very important thing to me personally, but also it's where the most significant and recent evolutions in the Code of Ethics have been happening. And if you haven't seen it yet, it's where you're going to see the most tricky stuff land on your table. And so that, just letting you know, that's kind of where the rest of our time together is going to be spent on Article 10. So kind of going back to my own journey, as I got the chance to learn about the history of fair housing, possibly not unlike all of you in your idyllic part of the country. I'm like, well, it sucks to be Chicago. That's really bad. And that's very, very bad what they did to people up there. But I'm not from Chicago. I'm from the University of Illinois driven Champaign-Urbana metro area, where we are home to the 56,000 student campus, Big Ten Research University. We have a whole subdivision with street names that are named after local Nobel laureates. We're very enlightened here. We wouldn't do that sort of thing here. And we're too small a metro area to have actually appeared on the Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map. So you're not going to see a redlining map for Champaign. So then in 2018, I was speaking at a fair housing event focused on people with disabilities in the city of Chicago and mentioned I was from Champaign. And this woman came up to me on the sidelines, and her name is Kimberly Nevels. She is a HUD attorney from Champaign. And we quickly learned when she came up to me that we went to the same high school. She was 3 years ahead of me. Her mom is a universally beloved guidance counselor. I had a couple classes with her younger sister. So this is a woman who went to undergrad, was very successful, got into law school, completed law school, and now is literally in the fair housing business. So I had my smug little bubble of, we wouldn't do that sort of thing around here. We're too enlightened, until Kimberly said, oh yeah, Champaign is where I experienced my first housing discrimination as a young woman in my 20s. And I said, excuse me? And she said, now again, for the younger members of the audience today, back in the olden days, you would look for available apartments in something published on paper. And that only maybe was published every 2 or 4 weeks. And you wouldn't know if the apartment was still available. And so there were numbers in that advertisement, and you would get onto your landline telephone with a cord and you would call the number to make sure the apartment was still available. Well, this is exactly what Kimberly had done. So she's in her early 20s. She would see apartment ads. She would call to verify that they were still available before she would go out to see them. And the next thing she said was, I don't sound black on the phone. And then time after time after time, the apartments she had just verified were still available, were not available when a black woman got out of the car to go see them. And I started to realize my bubble was burst pretty dramatically in that moment. And then, of course, it didn't take long for me to realize, no, the scars of all of this same stuff are all over my own community. I go to a black church on the north end of Champaign, and I drive past this sign every Sunday morning on my way to church. In 1949, the first African-American subdivision in the Champaign area. That means in Champaign-Urbana, black people didn't have access to even basic middle-class new construction until 1949. They were shut out of anything else that was new. And not surprisingly, you've got this massive environmental cleanup from a utility company, gas processing site that has contaminated the air and the water. And not surprisingly, this sort of thing doesn't end up in white neighborhoods. This is the sort of use that gets put into black neighborhoods. And so the scars of all of this stuff are in my own home market, which for a long time I thought, well, we wouldn't have that. We wouldn't have done that here, except that we have, and we do. In the course of my journey, once I got to start learning about this stuff, and the most transformative influence on me has been, I have had a bunch of friends who, even before they knew me well enough to know that I deserved it, chose to take leaps of faith on me. And I am not ever going to know what it's like to sell real estate while black. And I've never sold real estate within 100 miles of the city of Chicago, but they have, several of them at different times, have given me a front row seat to get a close look. And, I can't unsee what they have allowed me to see. And we're still dealing with these issues all the time today. I'm a serious photographer, so these are some of my own photos, but every time I'll end up in Chicago and I'll post anything, I'll have somebody make a snide comment on social media, some white person from downstate, from central Illinois where I live, who asked if I had to dodge a lot of stray gunfire, that sort of thing. Because they assume Chicago, and certainly on the south side of Chicago, the streets are running with blood and you have a hail of gunfire at all times. And this, in fact, is the south side of Chicago. Frank Williams, whose house got firebombed. Zeke Morris, who has a real estate office on the south side, was dedicating an education center named in Frank's honor. And the day in 2018 that I went to the dedication, this was the block behind Zeke's office. This was the scene when I got out of my car with my camera. And this was the scene at the dedication. Here we are in 2018, and this was an event that should have been celebrated by the entirety of the Chicago real estate industry and the realtor organization, and I was the only white person anywhere nearby. I'm standing in the corner holding the camera. But this is Chicago. And lessons learned on the South Side in the time I've spent there. Before I do that, I'll tell the story of this photo. So 2017, I was Illinois Realtors president-elect. And in June of 2017, my friend Nakia, who is here in the camo jacket in the center. So that's Nakia. She was the first ever black female president of the Chicago Association of Realtors year before last. Sarah, to her right, was the second, and she's now the current president. Marky Lemons-Ryall on the end is a really well-known real estate trainer. Anyway, Nakia's 23-year-old son, Xavier, was walking a couple blocks from home in June of 2017, and he was on the phone with his girlfriend. And he told his girlfriend, "I'll call you right back. Somebody's coming up to ask me a question." And as far as we know, he was shot and left to die alone in a parking lot just off of 63rd Street for his cell phone. There was absolutely no other motive for it. This is somebody who had made every right life decision, graduated from a very competitive magnet high school, went away to college, played football, came back early because he joined a program called City Year to tutor inner city kids. So 23-year-old Xavier was shot and left to die. And his mom is going to spend the rest of her life wondering if he spent his last conscious moments wondering why she wasn't there. And she was close enough to hear the shots that killed him because that's how close to home they were. So I got a text message from Nakia, probably in July or August. That homicide was uncleared, like most of them in Chicago, and there was a Crime Stoppers organized neighborhood canvass going door knocking. And the invitation was to friends and family. I had no idea who was going to be there. And at that point, I didn't know the South Side very well at all. All I knew is I was being asked to go someplace where people like Xavier got shot and killed for no reason. And that's the group that showed up that day. And I didn't ask Nakia until just a few months ago, was I the only white person that was invited, or was I the only white person that showed up? And I was not the only white person.
who was invited. And it's just, another one of those visual confirmations of how segregated our lives and our cities still manage to be. So that is what that photo is from. So the lessons learned on the South Side: we still have Black real estate professionals doing twice the work for half the pay. In most metro areas, if you are dealing in areas that are predominantly Black or brown, you're going to find that the clientele is more complicated. You're dealing with people who are cobbling together gig economy income, which we all know is very hard to turn into mortgage qualifying income. And if you get all of these puzzle pieces put together and somebody's DoorDash plus Uber driving plus, handyman repair work, and you have enough income history to cobble that together as qualifying, you will have spent months doing it. And if you get that client across the finish line into a home, chances are you've sold them something for less than half the price of what Tommy Choi would be selling on average in Lincoln Park, and really more like a third or a fourth of the price. More than twice the work for half the pay. Looked askance when working in predominantly white neighborhoods and suburbs. How did you get that listing? What are you doing out here? Just when I thought I realized, even though it's not my lived experience, okay, I get that my Black and brown colleagues are much, much more likely to have a police interaction when they're fumbling around with a key box on a front porch. Imagine how much more terrified they are when the showing instructions say the key box is on the gas meter on the side of the house. Now I'm poking around during the short daylight winter days in somebody's backyard while Black or while brown. So you're still living in constant fear of the next episode of police interaction or terror or complaint, having to diversify their businesses to withstand recessions and the low Black and brown home ownership rates. So a lot of my colleagues on the South Side are running boutique firms where they're doing brokerage, property management, development work, and they maybe have contracts with the city for lead abatement, something like that. We badly underrepresent brokers of color across our realtor ranks generally. And we do it even worse in the ranks of leadership. So my friend Sarah Ware, who has this lovely way of imparting her knowledge upon me without me feeling like I've been beaten with a sledgehammer, had told me this once. We were sitting in a meeting. She said, here's the thing. What you all are doing here today, this is a luxury. You all have the ability to take the time to do what you're here doing. And as board members, you have to do a lot of other stuff as well as the time you're spending with me today. That's a luxury. You wouldn't be able to do it if your businesses weren't at critical mass. Who's least likely to be at critical mass? Anyone from a historically marginalized background. And as a result, and especially when you're dealing with the rigors of self-employment, as a result, we continually, everywhere in the country, badly underrepresent all non-white segments of the population in realtor membership, and we do it way worse when it comes to actual leadership roles. I didn't know the glass ceiling existed until I watched people I love bounce off of it. And then normal human nature, when somebody bounces off a glass ceiling with a concussion, would be, okay, that hurt. I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to do something else. It's really exceptional when you find somebody who just got a concussion on a glass ceiling who says, keep the glass ceiling, stay right there. I'm going to go get a battering ram and I will come back. But when you see people who break through it, just understand they have had to do something exceptional, absolutely exceptional, because chances are by the time they got to where they got, they bounced hard off of the ceiling and they decided they were still going to go after it anyway. And then having to be the only one. Deal with racist slurs and hate speech and embarrassing, dehumanizing racist episodes. So I told you we're going to spend the last bit of our time together talking about Article 10. And Article 10, the only change that was made to the article of late is the word handicap was changed to disability. And there was no change in intended meaning at all. It was simply us responding to a request to update the language because handicap was deemed potentially pejorative. But just a quick refresher, Article 10 is a sort of a threefold mandate. Realtors shall not deny equal professional service to any person for reasons of race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So we won't do it. We won't be parties to any plan to discriminate, and we won't discriminate in our employment practices. Threefold mandate not to discriminate. And interestingly, you heard me talk about how far on the wrong side of history our code was for decades, but gender identity and sexual orientation have both been in the code for years. I need to update the amended date because I swapped out disability, and that was from 2023, but the last update had been adding gender identity, and that's now 9 years old. you look at how much gender identity has been a subject in popular culture in just the last couple of years. And thankfully, the realtors have been on the right side of history and kind of ahead of the curve. Because we still have half of the jurisdictions in the country that have no legal protection on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. The code may be the only protection members of the LGBTQ community have in large swaths of the country. So standard of practice 10-5, that's the newest one. Realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. I hope that most of you look at that and hear that and think, shrug, well, of course not. But this is still quite new, and it was quite controversial. And so I'll tell you the story of the origin of this, but also why the ongoing interpretation of this is probably continues to be the most robust and fast developing area in our code. So just by happenstance, I was chair of the NAR Professional Standards Committee in 2020. I say happenstance because the appointment was initiated in 2018. So I was vice chair in 2019, and then by happenstance, 2020 rolls around and I'm sitting in the chair seat. And it wasn't lost on me that I was chair of a committee where my predecessor had presided over the same committee mandating that realtors engage in housing discrimination and mandating that we do inflict some amazing, staggering, and very long-lasting damage on huge segments of our population. So then as 2020, the pandemic shuts down everything. Most NAR committees meet only twice a year. They'll meet at the May meetings in DC, and they'll meet at convention week, wherever the NAR convention is. And that's it. And that's Pro Standards schedule as well for NAR, except the pandemic shut everything down and we moved to Zoom, which then meant all of a sudden I could call off-cycle meetings whenever I wanted. So we get into the pandemic shutdown. Our meetings are thrown off cycle, but with flexibility we have never had before. Oh, yes. And then we get to the middle of the year. Not the middle of the year, the end of May, and the country is on fire. And then President Vince Malta of NAR received numerous requests from state and local association leaders to come up with better tools for dealing with a proliferation of realtors engaging in bigoted hate speech. And in the course of our meetings, we had a literal stack of hate speech from realtors. And most of what we were dealing with at that time was racist hate speech, but that certainly didn't account for all of it. Probably the best not racist example of hate speech that we had was a former realtor in Metro Atlanta on his business Facebook page. The timeline would read, hey, check out this fine assortment of available real estate listings here in Metro Atlanta. And then right after that, and I quote, gays and lesbians are guilty of murder according to the scriptures. On the business Facebook page, have a nice day. And then after that, more fine listings available in Metro Atlanta. Like that's insane. That is insane. And we had probably the most over the top example of racist speech was a TikTok video recorded by a former realtor member on Long Island, who was shirtless, eyes bulging, looked like an absolute nutcase. He's waving a freshly purchased assault rifle. And he said, in response to all the looting and rioting, here's what I've got to say. I wish an N-word would. He's waving the rifle. I wish an N-word would. I just spent $1,300 on this mother effer, and I can't wait to use it. I'm a realtor, and I'm declaring open season on shooting black people. And there was a mountain of others, a mountain.
And I'm sure he didn't say it like that either.
No, it was unredacted. Unredacted. Yeah, somebody was starting to say something.
Yes. Does this standard of practice extend realtor to realtor, or is it just realtor to public?
Oh no, it is everything. So interestingly, in this, that's a really good question. So obviously, only realtors can be respondents in ethics cases, but everybody, so in law school, I had to do a semester of civil procedure, a semester of criminal procedure, and a semester of evidence. And there's a bunch of mind-numbing rules on standing, like who has standing to bring a complaint. And a lot of times test cases, end up getting dismissed without ever being decided because the person didn't have standing. We don't have a standing issue here. Everyone has standing to file an ethics complaint. Only realtors can be respondents, but anyone can file an ethics complaint against a realtor. Now, in modern history, up until 2020, in modern history, we had a policy statement in the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual, Policy Statement 29, that made the code enforceable only within the confines of real estate transactions and real estate related activities. So which makes sense. Most of the articles of the code are directly related to real estate activity. So that made sense, except this issue was, now wait a minute. And the analogy I use is, I can't, for those of you who know who Mr. Rogers is, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it would be for me to say the code only applies to my work when it comes to my fair housing obligations. Okay, so during the opening credits of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I'm coming in the door. I'm taking off my realtor emblazoned work sports coat. The big realtor R is emblazoned all across it. I take that off, put it in the coat closet, and now I am putting on my cozy private bigot cardigan. And now I'm in my cozy private bigot cardigan. And now that I'm safely in that and the realtor R is off of me because it's my private time, now I get on social media and start rage typing the most god awful, abhorrent, bigoted hate speech you can imagine. But don't worry, that's private bigot, Matt. In no way does that interfere with my ability to live up to the letter and the spirit of my Article 10 fair housing obligations. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. Every time one of these morons would have a viral video that caught a realtor behaving badly with bigoted hate speech, every single time when the news media picks it up, after they identify the name, what do you suppose the very next thing is that's mentioned?
Yeah, we all get grouped into
the
that.
person's a realtor. Yeah, every single time. And almost none of these cases happened in the course of the person's real estate work. And yet the fact that they were a realtor is realtor is not a job. Realtor is an identity. And so that was something that was discussed. So as part of this, we had to not only look at adding a standard of practice that would be specifically about bigoted hate speech, but also for this to actually mean something, we had to open up Policy Statement 29 to make the code apply to all of a realtor's activities. And again, I remind you, lest you think that that's an overreach, the entire rest of the code is about real estate activities. Really, by opening it up, it enabled Article 10 to go after private discriminatory behavior or speech. So hopefully that makes sense. Mary, did you have a different scenario in mind when you were asking who can file or realtor on realtor?
Basically, I just, there's some realtors are, and very blatantly using harassing speach to one gender, but wouldn't do it with another. And that's
yes. Okay. And gender-based hate speech, of course, is one. I mean, you've got, there's a whole, in fact, ironically, a huge association asked me to give a keynote on International Women's Day year before last, because of course you bring the white man up from the cornfields when you're looking for an International Women's Day keynote. But I was able to very quickly curate a whole library of gender-based hate speech from realtors. So and it is a double standard because there are pejoratives that would be aimed toward males, but I think overwhelmingly you find it aimed at females. So that absolutely is over the line. Also, I did have somebody who complained to me that he had filed a complaint because somebody used the B word pejoratively, and a panel, I think in a different state, didn't find that a violation. So I guess they would have maybe found the C word a violation, but not the B word. I don't know, but it was one of those where, no, wait a minute, but that is a gender-based form of hate speech. So harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs. And you notice this doesn't have a list of prohibited words because the words will evolve and change. What's allowed, what's disallowed, and also the context matters. But hell no, you don't get to have realtors using words that constitute hate speech aimed at gender. Now, we get a lot of hate speech and harassing speech based on things like politics. That's not a protected class. We, in fact, have a case interpretation about hate speech aimed at somebody in a political arena, in a political context, but that's not a protected class, and so that is not a violation.
Matt?
So, yeah.
Oh, good. You can hear me now.
Oh,
Great.
good.
So Matt, can you explain to the directors that it doesn't matter the articles, realtors can file on any against another realtor
Yeah.
on any of the articles?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as I said, realtors are the only ones that can be respondents, and we are open. We, as potential respondents, we are constantly accountable to every member of the public who can file a complaint, but also every single colleague who can file a complaint. This stuff is so radioactive that in some cases you get people in small market sandboxes, and your association's 4 times bigger than mine, but they still say, I don't want to out myself as being the one that filed this, that pulled the trigger. And remember, we don't have a standing issue. Anyone can file. We also don't have a prohibition against hearsay evidence. The traditional rules of evidence in court systems don't apply here. And so you can have, and in fact, we now are seeing, one of the associations I spoke at last month, you had a group of a whole group of complainants, all from distant parts of the country, that had seen a racist social media post by a realtor member in a very, very distant part of the country. And they banded together to file a complaint in that realtor's home marketplace. They intentionally did that because it had generated a huge amount of buzz and controversy in the local market, but nobody wanted to pull the trigger on it. And so several other people said, well, we'll do it from over here. And they did. So it is an unusual and unique level of accountability. So we had the country on fire. We had a proliferation of hate speech. Now the crazy dude with the assault rifle. And by the way, I watched your nonverbal reactions. I mean, that sends a chill down my spine. And I'm not the one who's being told that based on my skin color, I have a bullseye on my back and I might get shot. I mean, I cannot fully imagine how much more severe the impact is if I'm in the class of people he's saying, I am out to shoot and kill you. So in a case like that nut job, you can do something like get them kicked out for a violation of membership duties. But that is a very technical and not perfect way. And it certainly isn't a way that's designed to be load tested with dozens or hundreds of cases. And during 2020, NAR went from a few phone calls a year from the entire country with associations needing help on what do we do because we got to get somebody off of our roster because they've gone nuts, to this. And it was a tenfold increase just in the second half of 2020. So we had Vince Malta, the president at the time, that said to my committee, hey, look at this, see if there's a solution. He didn't say fix it. He didn't say do something. He said, look at it. And so I called a meeting on June 29th. So basically about a month after the George Floyd murder, and called a special meeting, except I had a 97% white committee. And that's unofficial. I know that because the last time we had met in person, I could count the non-white people on my fingers on one hand with fingers left over. And it's a very elite committee. Those are all really, really qualified volunteers, just like this group is a very elite group. You don't get here without meeting a lot of very high bars. But the problem is we were dealing with something that wasn't just racially charged, it was racially radioactive. And I wasn't sure how that particular committee was going to wrap its collective heart and head around something that was racially radioactive. And so I decided I wanted to start with a conversation on race and real estate. And at that moment in American history, we needed to hear Black voices, not voices of color generally. We needed Black voices. So I called 5 friends, industry leaders from different parts of the country, and said, would you be willing to be part of a no holds barred conversation on race and real estate? Nothing off limits, no preconditions, no advance notice of the questions, because I don't know what I'm going to ask you. And by the way, you'd be doing this so you could bare your souls for the enlightenment of a bunch of white people. Are you willing to do it? And they all said yes. And I knew that was no small thing when I made the request, but when I actually had the conversation, I genuinely felt guilty about some of what they were reliving for us. And with their permission, NAR was able to edit a video of this 90-minute conversation down to just a few minutes, because some of these stories I'm never, ever asking these people to tell again. So this is that conversation from June 29th of 2020, just a few minutes of it. And give me a thumbs up if the audio is audible. We have not rehearsed our conversation at all. They don't know what questions I'm going to be asking them.
For the first time, probably since 1968, people kind of are looking at, well, what do we need to do? Well, or why do we have to change things? And if you think about it from that perspective, how many things that we were talking about in 1964 are still being discussed today?
One of the things I'd like to share is that this is all reaching its height right now because somebody had a cell phone. A lot of what is happening has been happening for years, but there was no one in a position to be able to capture the moment, to be able to share the moment, and to put it in front of everyone who's in denial that that could possibly exist.
In the world of real estate, obviously there are exceptions, but what I have observed in the time I've gotten to spend in the Black real estate community is I have seen in general that my Black colleagues are often working twice as hard on deals that are twice as complicated so they can make half the money or less.
You didn't add the property value. Well, we already know anywhere with 51% or more Black people live, the value is inherently racist, systematically, devalued. So when you take that into consideration, now you have folks who have to cultivate relationships with clients. You have to make sure that from a proprietary standpoint, that you find a lender who's willing to give them the best terms and fair terms for the same type of a property that if you sold this same deal on the north side of Chicago, you would get 2.5 times the amount of commission based on home value that you make in the predominantly Black neighborhood.
Give me an example that comes to mind of a time where you have been cost business or been put at a disadvantage because you showed up and it turns out when you showed up for something, you showed up Black.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share. This is one that I don't think I'll ever really get over, and it really happened more than once. And making the appointment is one thing. Having a customer, or client, whether white or non-white, didn't make a difference. But when I showed up at the door and knocked on the door, and the owner opened the door and said, "They're allowed in, but you're not." Okay, so I turned to my clients and said, "Do you want to go in?" And they said, "If we cannot go in with you, we will not go in." This was a house that everything they wanted matched. Everything they wanted. So, and they were a white couple with me, and we had to walk away. Reporting it to the listing agent, and she says, "Oh, well, that was the owner's decision." That is not pro standards answer, right? Absolutely not. But that's the position that they decided to take. That has happened multiple times just over a few years. It wasn't like back to back, but over years that has happened. So yeah, it has cost. And I don't know if it cost me more in embarrassment or in money in my pocket.
But I get it, like you said, mostly in the higher price point when you go to a listing in an area that maybe the seller is showing, and that may not be Black, and your clients are Black, and they proceed to ask them a series of questions. My clients are somewhat like me, so because it's funny, especially when you have no idea who they are and what they do, but they will ask a series of questions over and over again, and then you get that agent a call and said, "Hey," I'm like, "Remember that pre-approval that I already sent before I even came to the listing? So you already knew that they could afford it. So why are we asking all these questions?" So are we fair housing? What's that line? But a lot of realtors are taking on that of their clients. I usually have clients that are somewhat like me from a personality standpoint. But you get like in a higher price point, well, I wouldn't say higher, 500 and over, you make it the series of questions that your client, and your clients are like, "What are they asking me to have 4? So, are these common? Because then it confuses your clients, and they're like, are they supposed to ask these questions? I'm like, no, and they already know. We know why they're asking.
What would you tell, what would your final thoughts to the committee be with regard to any opportunities to go from being not racist to potentially expanding the scope in the spirit of being more vociferously anti-racist?
So if we don't have the teeth that says, like, for example, the code says that if you're not doing a real estate transaction, if you make something a racist comment, then the perception is that it's okay. And I think it's now time for us to, as Realtors United, it's time for us to say enough is enough, and we have to stop saying, well, I don't want to get involved. We have to make the changes necessary to move things forward in the right direction.
This is a start. And I think it's going to start here with this committee, with the change in the codes, as what Zeke just said. So I'm looking forward to seeing this committee come up with some great ideas on how we can make change for all members, so we will not be considered racist in this association.
I think it's becoming more impactful right now because people are able to put a face to what they hear. I think that people knew or kind of felt like, you know, there is a little bit of disparity, or maybe there is none. But hearing it now with people that they know, I think is making everyone feel uncomfortable that some of these things are even being talked about today.
The idea that our Black brothers and sisters in our profession would be dehumanized in that manner in the course of doing their job is absolutely appalling, and it can't be easy to talk about.
So what I wanted to say is just look at this year as a sign of hopefulness. There's an old saying, when you know better, you do better. And so it's about relationships, and the relationships that we are putting together that allow us to be able to speak, and for others to say, well, now going forward, I know that I have to do something.
So the Joanne Poole part was the part that about had me reduced to a human puddle. I don't know what cost me more, the embarrassment or the money in my pocket. And one of the things that's going to be etched into my memory for as long as I live is I was in doing this in my home Zoom studio, and I had one of the monitors with 49 of the committee members, and I could watch the faces physically recoil in shock and horror at what they were hearing, that this is still what's happening to our colleagues, not occasionally, pretty much all the time. And so at that point, that committee was galvanized to do whatever it was that they could, whatever was within our reach in terms of pulling the levers of power to make that stop. We're all in. And they were the committee was the embodiment of the Maya Angelou quote that Zeke had, which is, when you know better, you do better. They were appalled and furious. Hey, Deb.
So my very first client in the real estate, it was a buyer. They were military, active military, and made an appointment for a showing. Got to go, met them at my office, took them to the showing in Barrington. And then when we showed up, the listing agent said, first I got out of the vehicle, and listing agent said, my client wants to know what your religious affiliation with. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, is Schusterman a Jewish name? And I went, absolutely. And they said, well, your clients can come in, but you can't. This is the listing agent now. And then when my clients got out of the vehicle, they were African Americans. And he says, they specifically said no Jews or N-words, okay, can come into this property or buy a property in this neighborhood. So that was my very first.
Year?
And this,
what year was this?
2012. And I was appalled. I'm retired Navy, so and I grew up in New York. So you talk about a melting pot. So I was like, so I went back, told my broker, And she said to me, well, what do you
People are
want me
lucky
to
they
do?
didn't have their heads and limbs ripped off by you at this point, I'm thinking.
I'm telling you, I was so pissed. And I did. I went back to my broker, apologized to my clients, and I said, not all Rhode Island is like this. Okay. Met them on the base the very next day. But I went back and talked to my broker, and she said, what do you want to do? You want to get a reputation out in the field right now? There's nothing you can do. And that to me was even worse than how we were treated. And this is 2012. So, I mean, we're in the 21st century. I mean, I've never grew up like that. So to me, that was my very first, how do you do into real estate?
What's so interesting and sad about that particular example is there are two things that make that worse than Joanne Poole's story. If I allow myself to really focus on the video, I will still get tears in my eyes listening to her. But you, in your case, that wasn't just some stupid bigot seller. It was the agent that was doing it. And it's almost like they got out two separate daggers, one that's aimed at your heart and a separate one that we've sharpened up to aim at their hearts on the basis of two separate sets of protected classes.
And then the broker was just as bad.
Right. Then to add insult to injury, that's insane. That's absolutely insane. And I was hoping, not that it would have made it okay, but I was hoping that the year was going to begin with 1 and 9. The fact that was not that long ago, that's ridiculous. So, folks, she just illustrated why we don't end up with the complaints when we need to. The penalties now are severe for this. Article 10 violation, that's deemed a violation of the public trust, i.e. a really bad act. The penalties are severe. And you had two victims, a realtor victim and a client victim, and nothing got done. That's every one of us. And as I said, hearsay evidence is not excluded. And so every one of us has the power when we hear a story like that, get the details and take action. Now, there's no substitute when it wasn't done on social media or a text exchange. There's no substitute for having Deb come in as a witness. But better Deb coming in as a witness, even though she was one of the victims of this, better her coming in as a witness than dragging the poor home buyers in. And at least she would be in a position. But I mean, the idea that somebody essentially said to you, basically engaged in victim shaming, you're not worth the trouble. You're going to stir up trouble and controversy, and you aren't worth that. And it will hurt you. No, what hurts is being dehumanized, and then having somebody else say, and I don't really think that's too big a deal. That would be one of the most potent, spontaneous firsthand accounts I've heard in the course of doing a lot of speaking gigs. So thank you for sharing that. And I also want to remind everybody, part of why when I get into these spaces, I never, part of why that video I just played is so powerful is I won't ever ask them to tell those stories again. And people in different audiences everywhere will have those stories, and I can't ever expect them to want to volunteer it, because on some level, the person who volunteers it is having to relive it. And a lot of these experiences are nothing short of dehumanizing. So when somebody like Deb chooses to tell us that this happened, not just to her clients, but directly to her, that is not a small deal for her to say, you know what, around this group of people, I am going to essentially bare my soul and tell you about something really unspeakably awful. So I'm so sorry that happened to you. I am thankful you were willing to tell us today, but it's appalling. So thank you for that. Any other questions or comments?
I got a question with that, and I'm dumbfounded.
Processing? Yes,
I'm
processing.
totally processing this, honestly. Like that's insanity for me. But is there a statute of limitations, quote unquote, for any of this, for this SOP, for this article?
Yes. So in the world of pro standards, and one of the most common things that will cause grievance to have to bounce something without going to hearing is that it exceeds what is effectively our statute of limitations. It is a flexible statute of limitations insofar as the complaint has to be initiated within 180 days of either the actual actions that were the basis of the complaint taking place, or the earliest time at which the complainant could have reasonably known.
Okay.
So certain acts that are concealed. So the thing is, you can't necessarily constantly refresh the statute of limitations by saying, well, Deb didn't file within 180, but Steve only heard about it on the 190th, and then Steve told Kelly, and there, we keep so. There, you can't have an endless chain of that, but there is some flexibility, but the flexibility requires that it be deemed something you could not have reasonably known about. Also, again, this is a relatively new rule, the anti-hate speech, but in Deb's case, obviously that was already a violation of Article 10 in the form that Article 10 existed at that time. It's insane. It predated gender identity being added as a protected class, probably postdated sexual orientation, but we were attacking somebody on the basis of religion and on the basis of race. And the other story that I'm hearing very, very commonly now, multiple markets, multiple individuals saying it happened to me and my clients, is the 21st century example of discrimination at the doorstep. What happened to Joanne Poole is markets that use showing time or some other electronic showing intermediary. Agent schedules, agent gets confirmation. Clients are on the doorstep in view of the Ring doorbell camera, and the showing is unilaterally canceled if they show up black or show up looking, Muslim or something. Numerous stories of this happening now. And so the biggest thing I want to impart upon you, because you have a very specific role here, I just want you to know this is not ancient history. This is an ongoing issue, and it affects way more people than you would. And I'm not saying than you would think. It affects way more people than I ever thought. I have never intentionally worn blinders ever in the almost 26 years that I've done this. But what I can tell you is that this stuff does not happen in front of me where I can see it. It just doesn't. And I had to learn secondhand that doesn't mean it's not happening, because the real challenge is my own senses tell me it's not happening. What do you mean? I live in this incredibly diverse market. I have never seen such a thing. No. And I've just now had to learn it's because it doesn't happen in front of me, and generally in front of people who look like me. And Deb, for her part, would never have imagined it would happen to her until she was in the middle of it.
Well, I've seen discrimination. Growing up in New York, like I said, I've seen discrimination. I have a very low tolerance towards discrimination. I think out of all my friends, I was the only one non-color. I played basketball, so we were at each other's houses. I've never, but I've seen, in their neighborhoods, the discrimination. So I know what it is, and I have a very low tolerance for it. And my whole 22 years in the Navy, never had to deal with discrimination. But I come up here from after I retire, and I'm up in north, thinking everything's great, and this happened, and I was flabbergasted. I don't put up with it anymore. I'll respond in kind. Now I just don't tolerate it, and I know now. I'm a broker, so I know now what the repercussions can be. But back then, I went to my broker like I was told to do if it was any problem. So I was just appalled. I just couldn't believe, that this still went on. I grew up I was born in the mid-50s, so I got to see the civil rights movement firsthand. And that appalled me. And I didn't think in 2012 that was still going on in this country.
It's interesting because Deb is, I talked about how much courage it takes if you're somebody who gets a concussion bouncing off a glass ceiling to then say, I'm going to go at it again until I demolish it. And I use Michelle as the example of, I'm not going to take the time or the emotional or mental energy to file the complaint because it would paralyze, and I have other more important things to do. And Deb is several layers of exceptional because she has been on the receiving end of it, and as she said, has low tolerance. And at this point in her career, and based on the totality of her life experiences, I sort of get the impression that she just wouldn't stand for it. And I just want to encourage all of us. We all need to look at this as ultimately it boils down to hate has no home here. And we all have to say, not only, it's not enough to say we're not going to do it. We all have to decide we're not going to tolerate it. We won't stand for it. And if we ever catch wind of something like that, that you just heard from one of your fellow board members, if you ever even hear about it, you're going to ask questions and find out more, and you be the one to file the complaint. There is no standing requirement here. Anyone can file the complaint. But my goal in what I do is I want to sensitize people, educate people to stuff that they didn't know, just like I didn't know for the first 20 plus years of my career, that this was still an issue. I want people to have their eyes open to it, but I then want them to realize this is, I shouldn't have to stand for this. Nobody should have to stand for this. And we each have the power to make sure that people don't. You all can make your volunteer roles that you're already in are huge for impacting the industry, and our industry directly impacts the rest of the economy and our communities. You all are difference makers in exactly the spots you are already in. But when you look at this stuff and you look at the code of ethics and you look at the rules and you look at the enforcement protocols, everyone has the power to make sure that we do our part to eradicate this. In a perfect world, we would change every heart and every mind. In an imperfect world, the ones that we don't change at least recognize it is not socially acceptable to do that, and you will pay a steep price. So whether your heart or your mind has changed, you will be driven into the sewers, because you will learn very quickly you cannot afford to do that in public where other people see it or hear it. Deb, again, thank you, and I am so terribly sorry. So the Long Island Divided expose, I've got a really, really short video from that as an example of what still happens. Oops, let me go back. Go back 3 slides apparently, so I can click the second time and make the video play. One moment.
In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester. And they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor. They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
You pre-qualified, I asked. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. We've done some preliminary talks, about getting pre-approval.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out any money unless you have a pre-qualification letter. So I need to know that means I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings. And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. They had the same finances, the same budget, and they made the same request in the same area. But one was white, the other was black. The agent treated them differently.
That was a really stark divergence. I still don't think the agent knew she was doing it. I'm fairly sure there was no intention, didn't know she was discriminating while she was in the middle of doing it, and probably initially when called out on it after the fact, probably until and unless she looked at the hidden camera footage, wouldn't have known that she did. So even something as kind of far over the line as that is, I still imagine that could happen without any intention. This is a better example. It's more subtle. If you put yourself in the shoes of a black consumer or a white consumer getting this advice in a vacuum, you didn't have anyone else's experience to compare it to. In either case, it would sound like you were getting good, solid, professional advice to the black tester, but it's some definite backup options. If you don't like the houses, they're too small, too much work, you want to upgrade a house, we have to downgrade, not that it's bad, we're just downgrading the location or the town a little bit, and then we're going to try to get you more house. white test, but like usually coming from the West, some of these towns, in my opinion, they're not necessarily the greatest in terms of school district safety, crime, resale. And some of them are very expensive. You're not really getting much there. Again, if you were told either of those things, you would feel like that's somebody giving me good, sound, professional advice and counsel. But the problem is, of course, they were identically situated buyers. And now that you look at one black, one white, here's the subtext. If you're black, your money's going to go farther here. If you're white, run for your life. Safety, crime, schools, resale. Huge difference. And this stuff happens without people intending it to, which is quite appalling. I'm going to spend, because we're now down to our last 12 or so minutes, I'm going to spend a little time on a 10-5 example. So 10-5, the anti-hate speech prohibition, or the hate speech prohibition. So use this. Let's look at this as this was an actual Instagram post, but assume that this was posted by a realtor. So you got the N-word being used, and the poster, who is now the respondent for the purposes of this example, is a black female. So we're using the N-word. The sad part, and MFS, for those who don't know, is an abbreviation for mother effers. I've had to explain that more than once when I've given this, used this as an example. So we've got some profanity, but we've got the N-word in here. So it's a realtor in our example. We're going to assume it's a realtor that posted this. Another realtor filed an ethics complaint alleging a violation of Article 10 as supported by SOP 10-5. And as I said, the respondent who posted this is a black female. What say you? Is this a violation? Is it not?
So I think it is. So when people use slur words, you're giving everybody else, permission to use it. So I don't know if it's a violation, but I have a problem with it.
Okay, that's very fair. Very fair.
I think if
that's a good, but I want to just stay again. That actually, I love how you just said that. I have a problem with it, not yet sure, but that's actually great because you're recognizing I don't feel right with that. I'm personally not cool with that. But you're still withholding judgment on, not 100% sure whether it's over the line when it comes to a violation. Somebody else is starting to speak.
I think it's not okay because it could certainly offend people. And I'm with Deb. It doesn't feel right in my belly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, isn't it about the receiver who's receiving it and who's complaining about it?
Absolutely.
Oh, that's okay. I'm so glad you said that. Yep. All right. So in this example, this was posted by somebody who was not at that time licensed, never has gotten licensed, but wasn't licensed, but was working for a realtor. The problem here is public Instagram feeds, several thousand followers. Essentially, it's broadcasting it to the world. So when to Steve's point, so that the respondent's defense would be, now listen, I got N-word immunity, I'm a black female. So there's that would be asserted. I'm not taking sides here, but that would be the assertion. But then you go back to, okay, even so, if you're using the N-word to refer to black males generally, all it takes is any black male who sees this that says, I'm not okay with that. Because I go back to Steve talking about the receiver end of it. And, having been married before, it's like, it doesn't matter what I meant. It matters what was received. So we look at factors like, okay, does it matter if this were an actual hearing? Does it matter that this was public, that this was effectively broadcast? I mean, somebody with 10,000 Instagram followers, it's probably being seen by more people than are listening to a lot of small market talk radio stations. But let's look at some different twists. What if it's a member of the public who overheard a realtor say this out loud to a friend at the bar? So now let's go to Steve's point about it matters what the receiver says. So many of us looked at the Instagram post and said, that sure feels like a violation. And as we examine it carefully against the backdrop of the actual rule, yeah, I think a lot of us would say it is a violation, notwithstanding the fact that the poster was a black female and would argue N-word immunity and would argue probably earnestly that she didn't mean it as hate speech in the context. But still, you're broadcasting it to the entire world in that instance. So now let's go to this scenario. Okay, so that the way this hearing is going to work out in scenario number one is you're going to have the respondent who says, I didn't mean it as hate speech. And I'm producing a witness who was the only other person I was actually talking to. I was overheard at a bar by somebody else, but the only other person I was actually talking to is here to testify. Yep. And I didn't receive it as hate speech. Now we got the transmitter and we got the receiver. They're both saying no hate speech transmitted, no hate speech received. I would suggest that under those circumstances, it would be very hard to say that that is a violation, that it constituted harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs, with the combination of private conversation, and clearly not in a private setting, somebody overheard it. But when both the transmitter and the receiver say no hate speech on either end of this equation, that becomes a difficult situation to say, well, we're here to tell you different. Now, I'm not the final answer on this, but I think in that scenario, if you had that witness, it'd be pretty hard to say that was over the line. What if it's a social media that repost of somebody else's words? What if it, and this has become very popular with rich white suburban kids, is getting caught on TikTok lip syncing with music that has the N-word in it. Now you have white people who are lip syncing with music that has the N-word. So what if a realtor does that? So you've got all these different twists, and your pro standards hearing panelists will be grappling with a lot of different questions here, and you'll be looking at it, and poor Linda is going to be putting together all of these dots in her findings of fact that you then have to go back and reconnect with your hearts, and more importantly than your hearts, your minds, because some of these issues, our hearts and our minds will slightly diverge. My heart tells me that is wrong. My mind tells me under this specific set of circumstances, it may not constitute a violation of the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics.
So here's another scenario. What happens if one of the respondents, who is a friend, okay, is white, and then responds using the N-word? So, you know, they respond in kind, okay?
Sure.
So that's, you know, that could be misconstrued or construed as a violation.
Sure, absolutely. And the other thing that we have to look at is, honestly, if I, like, the last thing on earth I would want is to be chairing a hearing panel of all white people, trying to figure out, was this a situation where this would be considered pretty socially acceptable and not hate speech under this context? Because if we don't have an inclusive panel, I'm going to feel like we are literally not qualified to make this determination. So it's just an example of where diversity is not just important for the sake of getting different skin colors. It's also important because of the different perspectives. Like, I will find myself when I'm a hearing chair, I'm having to be the referee. So my mind is occupied doing some additional things and refereeing and knowing when I got to cut off somebody who's wandered totally off onto a tangent. But my panelists, when they come up with a question where I'm just like, I just sit back and I'm like, I could have sat here for 5 hours and I would have never thought of that question. And it's brilliant. What that tells me is somebody else's mind on this panel is wired differently than mine, and their heart, their mind, and their perspective is different enough that they are coming at this with questions I wouldn't have thought of. That's really ultimately where the diversity and the inclusion value lies. It's not that there's a magic power by getting to somebody with a different amount of melanin. It's the different background, different perspective, because what happens is, if I'm in a panel with a bunch of people with similar backgrounds to mine and I say something and everyone immediately agrees, what do I tend to think? Oh, look, I'm the most brilliant person on planet Earth. They're all in lockstep with me. Everything I say they think is brilliant. Clearly, the conclusion is I'm brilliant. No, clearly the conclusion really is we're engaging in groupthink without realizing it. We're self-reinforcing, and we're not getting somebody from a divergent point of view to ask us questions and slow us down and force us to go through this more carefully. And again, the seat that you occupy doesn't mean, especially with the work that Linda does between hearing and you reviewing it, doesn't mean your jobs won't be done very, very quickly. But it still has to be a full stop. Give this a careful, constructive look. And especially if it's something where a given panel, through no fault of any individual, ended up engaging in groupthink without knowing it because no one was there to ask the other question. So you do play a very important role in that. I want to conclude our time together by just by sharing with you an Isabel Wilkerson quote from her book Cast. And one of these things is, why is this our problem? We're not the ones that broke this. This system was broken long before any of us got here. And so why is it our problem to fix it? And Isabel Wilkerson uses a real estate related analogy in her book Cast. We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched but deeper, ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never intact indigenous people never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We didn't erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. And any further deterioration is, in fact, on our hands. Unaddressed, the ruptures and diagonal cracks will not fix themselves. The toxins will not go away, but rather will spread, leach, and mutate as they already have. When people live in an old house, they come to adjust to the idiosyncrasies and outright dangers skulking in an old structure. They put buckets under a wet ceiling, prop up groaning floors, learn to step over that rotting wood tread in the staircase. The awkward becomes acceptable, and the unacceptable becomes merely inconvenient. Live with it long enough, and the unthinkable becomes normal. Exposed over the generations, we learn to believe that the incomprehensible is the way life is supposed to be. Deb's broker 10 years ago basically told her something that is incomprehensibly evil to most of us that heard her say it. Nope, just suck it up. That's life. That's the way life is supposed to be. I encourage you all to take those words and recognize what Deb said. I have a very low intolerance for this stuff. I encourage you all to determine for yourselves, I now have a very low tolerance for this stuff. I hope you all sense you are each part of the solution. My life in the last 5 or 6 years is a huge testament to the fact that God could use a very, very unlikely person from the middle of the cornfields in central Illinois to move the needle on these things. And if I can be used in that way, and I'm the most unlikely, each of you is even more well suited for it. And then I'm looking at a board, a collective, and the power of you as a collective is exponentially greater. The most powerful thing we all heard in our time together was Deb sharing. Keep that in your mind when you think about Isabel Wilkerson's quote that we learn to believe the incomprehensible is the way life is supposed to be. Be intolerant of that. Hell no, it's not. And we won't stand for it. Thank you all for the fact that you volunteer. Your work is so important. You probably knew that before we got together today, but I hope you have a renewed sense of how important it is. I'm here to talk to you about one tiny little slice of what your role is on the board of directors, and yet that one little slice is still immeasurably important. And it's not just important to protect the reputation of the industry. It is important for making the world better, for righting wrongs, for preventing and making sure that we account for injustices. So thank you for your time today. I'm so terribly sorry that I was surprised by when we were getting together, and I appreciate your grace and graciousness with that. But thank you for the time, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Matt.
Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank
You
you.
are very welcome.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Matt.
Matt.
And thank
That's
you,
excellent.
everybody, for joining us today and taking the time. I hope everybody enjoyed that.
Very good.
Thanks for arranging. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye now. Thanks, Matt.
Linda, thank you so much.
I'm
Tracy and
glad
I
we
have been
made
talking about this
happen.
for a while. Right. I have never in my life had any such thing. So I'm so sorry.
Oh,
The
it's
closest
okay.
thing I had happened, I presented in Guam and I correctly figured the time change in terms of time of day, but I missed that it put it on a different day of the week. And
okay.
and I ended up presenting for 7 hours in the Eastern time zone and then doing a second shift.
Oh boy. Oh wow. Well, I just admire you. I'm so happy. This isn't the first time that I've had professional standards training, whether it be for committee members or for the board of directors. And I loved your perspective. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I
And
do
thanks for all
serve
you do.
on NAR's Professional Standards Committee. I just completed my first term, my first year. And, you know, I've been attending those meetings for years in my role as an administrator and also as CEO. And I'm just honored to be serving on it. And I have I have attended many of your webinars and meetings, so I knew you'd be the right person.
Thank you for the vote of confidence, but also thanks for your involvement. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So I'm glad we got through this. Thanks for everything, Matt, and hope to see you soon.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again, Linda. I appreciate
All right.
you. Have a
Take
great
care.
day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.